So we were having our Christmas Eve dinner. Turkey, stuffing, and other dishes that you would expect to get on Thanksgiving night. We don't have a big family. It was my grandparents and uncles from my mom's side of the family. At the time, we lived in a duplex with some guy and his girlfriend on the other side. We never really saw them much. Strangely, we had a door that connected our sides, and no, that's not something that most duplexes have. It had a very unique kind of lock though. It had to be unlocked from both sides to be opened, and it could open in either direction. I only saw it open once before the two moved in, ever since the door had been locked, at least on our side. While we were sitting at the dinner table eating, the doorknob to the door that separates the sides of our duplex twisted and turned before the lock would block it. It was not accidental, as it was going on for at least 10 seconds. My dad got up and walked over to the door, placed one hand on the lock and one hand on the doorknob. "You need something?" There was no answer. He unlocked our side of the door and swung it open. Their side of the duplex was completely pitch black. It seemed as if nobody was home. It was only about 6 o'clock, and we were certain we saw them leaving earlier. Me and my dad went to check out the window, and their car was gone too. Being good neighbors, we assumed the worst, that there may have been an intruder, so me, my dad, and my uncle went to the other side to investigate. We flipped on all the lights and checked every corner and every crevice of the small first floor. Then we heard a thud and a crack from upstairs. It was pressure on the floorboards. I was freaked out, so I stayed behind while my dad and uncle ran upstairs. I felt my heart skip a beat when a huge commotion erupted from upstairs, before the scream from my uncle echoed across the duplex even to the other side as my whole family got up from the table now. Moments later, my dad came rushing down with my uncle beside him, with his hand covering his lower shoulder or chest area. There was a stab wound. We all hurried back to our side of the apartment and locked the door. We dialed 911 and simultaneously heard rapid stomping coming from the other side, and then heavy banging and ramming into the door to the point where there were small chips and cracks forming. We could hear the grunting and screaming of the man as he rammed into the door. My other uncle and my dad each grabbed kitchen knives. I armed myself as well. They told all of us to stand back while they waited by the door. Thankfully, the man on the other side gave up before the door gave in, and we heard him exit out the front door. We watched through the window, and we all saw his face as he ran through the snow and turned to see us through the glass. He took off in his black Honda Civic down the slushy roads. It doesn't end there. The following year, the same neighbors still lived there, and they seemed to be having a Christmas get-together with a few people. By chance, I was looking out my bedroom window, being a sketchy snoop, when I recognized one of their guests to be the same man who had allegedly broken into their side of the duplex. When I told my dad, he agreed, and we approached them about it. He denied any knowledge of what we said, and even our neighbors defended him, saying he was from out of state. There was nothing we could do for proof, but we knew one thing. Those neighbors, for whatever reason, set that up. We moved out about a month later after our newgrown fear of those neighbors became too much. This happened when I was only 5 years old. It was Christmas Eve night, meaning I guess it was technically Christmas, and I had awoken at probably 3 a.m. or something. I walked downstairs to the living room out of my little boy curiosity to see if Santa had delivered any presents yet. The tree was full of presents underneath already. I was so happy. Santa had come already. But what was this? There was someone in the kitchen going through the fridge. I remember stepping into the kitchen and seeing a really tall man going through the fridge chugging a milk carton. When he spotted me, he put the carton back in the fridge and shut the door. He then put his fingers on his lips to tell me to be quiet. Are you Santa?" I asked him. "Yes, I am," he told me quietly. He walked past me, patted me on the head, and stepped into the living room next to the tree. I don't know what I was thinking, even at 5 years old, as he wasn't wearing anything even resembling Santa. He looked around at all the gifts. I thanked him for all the presents as he began picking up the bigger boxes. I remember being confused, and I'm pretty sure I asked him why he was doing what he was doing. but I don't remember exactly what he said. I believe it was along the lines of just replacing the gifts with better ones in my sled. I believed whatever he said though. He walks out the back door with 3 boxes, came back momentarily to grab more, then left once again. He came back in and patted me on the back and told me not to tell my parents that I saw him. I smiled and agreed, and he took off with the boxes. I waited for him to come back with the replacement gifts, but he never did. I eventually went up to tell my parents despite what he said. When my parents realized I wasn't joking, they sat up in shock and fear and ran past me downstairs. When they saw half the presents were gone and the back door was left wide open, my mom screamed like a deranged person. I remember my parents were practically scolding me, demanding for me to describe the person who entered our house. Of course, being 5 years old, the description I gave was anything but useful. All I probably told them was that he was tall. It's been almost 15 years now though, and at this point for me, being that I was only 5 years old, it's nothing but a story to tell, rather than a bad memory at all. Did you ever used to have a fear of those guys who would dress up as Santa Claus in the mall or at Christmas parties? Up until the age of about 8, I certainly did. I think I was 6 or 7 years old when me and my mom were walking through the mall with all of the Christmas festivities and decorations up. Festive bands playing jingle bells, a giant tree in the center of the mall, and of course a mall Santa sitting in a chair covered by a green blanket. There was a small line of kids and parents waiting to sit on the Santa's lap. Maybe 2 or 3 kids. My mom insisted I sat on his lap. Normally it would be the other way around, the kid begging the parent to sit on the lap, but she knew how shy I was. There wasn't anyone by the mall Santa's side, like one of those people who calls the next child up. It was just him. When I sat on the stranger's lap, he grabbed me by the chest and said softly in my ear, "What do you want for Christmas?" I think I said a Game Boy Advance. He laughed and assured me I would receive one. Then, for whatever reason, my mom walked up to the Santa and said something quietly to him. He chuckled in response to whatever she said and then said no problem. My mom told me to wait there by the Santa for a few minutes until she came back. At this point, there were no more kids waiting to sit on his lap, so his attention was directed at me. He told me to come over and sit on his lap again. I somehow obeyed, despite my fear of Santa Claus. When I sat on his lap, he pulled me closer to him so that my back was leaning on him. When I think back on this moment now, it's all the more painful and creepy. He then whispered in my ear that he had a Game Boy Advance outside by his sled, and if I followed him, I would get it right now and wouldn't have to wait until Christmas. My fear suddenly turned to excitement as I believed him. We both stepped off the chair, and I followed him down one of the exit hallways, but halfway through, he stopped and told me we should take a bathroom break first. We stepped into the bathroom, and he quickly locked the door. I turned and looked at him as he looked at me. But before anything else could happen, there was a frantic banging at the door. Somebody on the other side was yelling to open up. The Santa opened the door and a man pulled him out and shoved him. The man then escorted me back to the center of the mall, asking me where my mom went. I watched as a fake Santa casually walked out the exit door and out of my sight. When my mom came back, the man explained everything. I'm pretty sure he was watching the whole time. So he and my mom asked around to see if the mall hired any mall Santas for the day. They did not. Whoever that was just a pervert dressed as Santa to get kids to sit on his lap and possibly wait for a perfect opportunity to snatch one, just like he almost did me. This story took place about 5 years ago on Christmas Eve night. It was around 1 in the morning, and I had just finished placing presents under the tree. I went upstairs to brush up and everything, then came back downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water before bed. My son Jake, who was 4 at the time, was standing by the stairs leading to the basement. I asked him what he was doing up so late. He pointed down the stairs and said, "Santa." I picked him up and carried him back to his room. I took a glass of water and went to bed. I woke up around an hour later to my son running down the hall outside my room. I sighed and got out of bed. As I was going down the stairs, I saw Jake by the tree looking at presents. Then he ran past me into the basement stairs again. He pointed down the stairs again. This time I looked down the stairwell, and my heart dropped as I saw a black figure sitting on the bottom step. I almost screamed, but I somehow held it in. I pulled my son quietly away from the basement door and closer to the front door of the house. I moved my hand away from my son's mouth to reach for the lock in the doorknob. I tried to pull the door open as quietly as possible, but it was pointless. The squeaky hinges let out the usual ear-piercing screeches, and I cringed in my mouth and eyes as I did. Suddenly, there were heavy stomps coming from up the basement stairs. I screamed and pushed open the storm door and practically threw Jake outside. I shut both doors behind us and we ran to the neighbor's house. I rang the doorbell as fast as possible, probably 30 times before they answered. After that, we went inside and stayed there and waited for the police. Whoever that person was gone though, as determined after the police conducted a thorough investigation of the house. I ended up lying to Jake, telling him that actually was Santa Claus, but a few years later, he remembered the incident and became a little more wise to what actually happened.
My dad always loved going crazy with the Christmas lights when I was young. He was an overachiever with it, and always had to have the most impressive display on the block. The year of 2010 was no exception. He set the lights up on timers so that they'd flash along to certain Christmas songs, which was becoming a popular trend in 2010. We had a bunch of onlookers and people stop by and take videos. My dad always ate that up. This was on a night where there was a light snowfall, and it was below freezing out, so not the weather a lot of onlookers would want to come and check out the display. There were a couple that we noticed, a woman and then a man. The woman left after a few minutes. The man stayed and admired it. We saw a smile on his face. He stayed for quite some time actually, and I knew my dad loved that. Eventually it got late, and it started snowing a little heavier, so my dad pulled the plug on the lights for the night. Quite literally pulled the plug. The lights and music outside stopped, and on that note, that meant the night was approaching its end. Everyone went upstairs to shower or brush their teeth or do whatever they had to do. I went to my room upstairs and looked out the window, as a curiosity thing to see how many people still had their lights on at this hour. Only a couple houses. But I picked up on more than just that. That man who was admiring the lights was still outside on the sidewalk facing the house, even though all the lights were now off. I called my dad over, a bit confused and concerned. He came to the window with me and looked out. "What do you think he's doing?" I asked. "I don't know," my dad said. We both assumed the guy might be waiting for the lights to turn back on. Either that or he may be loony, or both. My dad said just lower the blinds and ignore it, he'll go away eventually. I brushed my teeth, got some water, then turned off my light and climbed into bed. I heard the little flakes of snow tapping on the window, a sound I always found very relaxing, but I wasn't relaxed. I was wide awake and curious. I had to look out my window. I pulled the blind up just a little to sneak a peek outside. The man was gone, but I could see footprints in the snow on our front lawn, which started from the sidewalk. Curiosity got the best of me. I tiptoed downstairs to the front door, which has 3 square glass windows at the top of it. I peeked through that glass, and I wish I hadn't. He was standing on the other side of the door, looking at the glass window, a big smile on his face, accentuating his crow's feet and smile lines. He had a mustache and was wearing one of those old-time wool caps and a large black coat. He had a look of crazy in his eye. For that brief couple of seconds I looked at him before falling back screaming. Everyone came out of their rooms in response to my screams. I pulled the front door open for my dad to see. The man wasn't on the stoop anymore, but we saw him quickly walking across the street into the park. My dad, brother, and I all rushed to put on our shoes, skipping the coats so to not waste time. We chased after him by following his footprints into the park. I was so cold it felt like thousands of icicles were stabbing my body. We got across the street to the park and went into the trees, but following the footprints got harder under the trees as less snow had accumulated, until there was not enough snow at all to even leave footprints in. We had to give up and run back home to warmth. Technically, we don't know if that man did anything illegal, just downright disturbing and creepy. Maybe he was messing with my family, maybe he was mentally ill. None of these questions will ever be answered, though. I was on my way home from working a graveyard shift on Christmas Eve night. It was a snowy night. The roads were icy and slippery. I was driving slow and cautious, listening to Christmas music. There were next to no cars on the road at all, just the occasional snowplow truck. I was on a quiet service road when I came to a red light. There were 2 cars in front of me. The light quickly turned green, but the cars didn't move. I'm not the type to honk, if ever, but after 30 seconds of neither of the cars moving, I finally tapped on the horn. Still nothing. The car in front of me wasn't even honking at the car in front of him. Another 20 seconds passed, and I honked again. I noticed someone on the sidewalk watching this happen. I thought he must be thinking, what an asshole, whoever's in the front car. We were sitting there so long now that the light changed to red again. Like I said, I'm not the type to honk, so I'm definitely not the type to get out of my car and confront someone. But this was too much. I was exhausted and wanted to go home. I got out from my car and walked over to the car in front of me, which for the record was still on. Both of them were. When I knocked on the window, I looked inside. The car was empty. I walked to the car in front of it, and it was empty too. There was no way to explain this. 2 running cars blocking a lane. No one inside either of them. No signs of an accident or anything. I was ready to ask that guy on the sidewalk if one of these cars were his, but when I looked in the direction where he was standing, he wasn't there anymore. The light turned green. Okay, whatever. I was gonna drive around them on the opposite side of the road and be gone. So that's what I did. I was way too unsettled to stick around there. A few blocks down, I saw a cop car parked in an empty parking lot. Unfortunately, I missed the entrance, so I started honking my horn and flashing my lights to get his attention, and it worked. He turned his car on and exited the parking lot to pull up behind me on the road. It felt like he was pulling me over, kind of, because he exited his car to walk up to mine. I didn't leave my car as a respect thing, I guess. I lowered my window and told him about the 2 weird abandoned cars back there and how they were obstructing traffic. He thanked me and said he'd check it out. Then his attention turned to something in the back seat, and he said, "Why is he laying on the floor like that?" "What?" I said. I turned around and saw a hooded man laying on the floor of my car. I screamed in front of the cop. I stepped out and yelled at the cop that I didn't know him. The cop drew his gun and ordered the guy to step out with his hands raised. He did so. When the man was in handcuffs, I recognized him as the guy standing on the side of the road. So I told the cop. The cop called for backup. He shook my hand and told me he'd take care of the rest, and to get home safe, and we wished each other a Merry Christmas. I drove home with a mix of emotions, but that Christmas, all I know is I had a newfound appreciation for police officers. My wife and I live in a duplex in Queens, New York. Last month, 2 upper middle-aged women moved in next door. We never had the chance to greet them the first few days. They seemed very quickly in and out at first. On, say, the 4th day, I caught one of the women carrying a box from her car into her side of the house, so I walked out to finally greet her. Her name is Frances, and she seemed normal enough, but she also seemed like she was in a hurry, so I didn't steal too much of her time. The next day was Christmas Eve, so my wife and I were preparing to host my sister and their families. During our Christmas Eve dinner, which was going completely normal, we all went silent and looked at the door when we all heard the sound of someone trying to push open the locked door. I got up and opened the door to see who it was. By the time I opened the door, there was no one on the stoop, but there was this woman walking down the sidewalk. I began to call out, but stopped mid-first word, deciding not to even bother. Maybe she had the wrong house, and that's what I said to my family when I sat down. Wrong house. My family all left around 9 that night. After that, the wife and I began our cleanup. I was mid-washing dishes when the front door opened and then shut pretty aggressively. In my head, it could have been my wife or any of my sisters returning because they forgot something. When I called for my wife and she answered from a different room, I knew it wasn't her. So I turned off the sink, dried my hands, and walked into the living room. There was a woman sitting in my big recliner chair in the corner. She was looking at the wall, muttering something to herself. I recognized her to be one of the women from next door. My wife entered the room and gasped. I calmly told the woman she was on the wrong side of the house.
Then she looked at me and continued muttering inaudible words. There was clearly some form of dementia. I told my wife to go hurry and knock on the neighbor's door. My wife left and was back with Frances surprisingly quickly. Frances seemed very relieved and grabbed the woman by the arm and pulled her off the chair and out of the house to their side. Frances came back a minute later to apologize and explain that her sister has what's known as sundowning syndrome, a form of dementia in which the symptoms get worse as the day goes on. I asked a question I felt rather important, which was, does she get aggressive at all in this state? I didn't like her answer. She said it's just best to leave her alone later in the day when she starts acting up. I wasn't overly friendly considering I was pretty taken aback by what just happened, but I wasn't rude either. Frances left, and my wife and I just looked at each other with these what the hell just happened looks on our faces. Anyway, this time I remembered to lock the door. The next day we went to my wife's parents' house for Christmas dinner. It was a nice time. We got home late since they live about an hour away, so I'd say we got home around 11. We cuddled up in bed and watched whatever Christmas movie was still on at that point. After that, our Christmas was over, and we cut the TV and went to sleep. My eyes opened to a dark room. I sensed I had been woken up by a noise. I looked around the room and spotted her walking out of the room and into the hall. "Honey, are you okay?" "Huh?" I heard next to me in a groggy, half-asleep voice. My wife was still laying next to me in the bed. I leaped out of bed, looked down the hall, and saw the tall, lanky figure of who I could only assume to be that woman from next door. She noticed me in the doorway. I yelled "wrong house" before slamming the bedroom door shut and locking it. I heard her march down the hall back to our door and try opening it. She tried pushing and shoving the door, making these weird, angry noises. I called the police and said our new neighbor with dementia had broken in and might possibly be violent. I requested they ring the neighboring door to wake up Frances and get her to come in here. Waiting for the police was a miserable, nail-biting experience. When they finally did come, I left our room and went to the front door to let them in. Frances came in with the police, extremely worried and apologetic. Her sister was walking around in our basement, all confused-like. Frances took her back to the other side once again, then came back out to talk with the police and I. She expressed sincere sorrow and gratitude for me not hurting her. I told her firmly this was not okay, and warned if this happened again that I would consider pressing charges. From that point on, we obviously locked everything, including windows. Frances' sister eventually went to go live with their mother instead. Thank God for us.
As a father of two, Christmas is already a stressful time of year for me. 2 Christmases ago, my kids were still in love with the idea of Santa Claus. After watching the Polar Express as a family, my wife tucked the kids into bed and she started putting the presents under the tree. I didn't really do any of that stuff. I just laid in bed watching something on TV waiting for her to come up. By the time she was done, we were ready for bed. We're early birds when it comes to sleep. I'm also a pretty good sleeper. I'm lucky enough to be able to knock out within a few minutes. And waking up in the middle of the night is unusual for me, which is why I was confused at first when I woke up that night. Then I realized why. My daughter Kelsey was in the room, saying "Daddy" over and over. I rubbed my eyes and asked her what's wrong. She had this cute little happy smile on her face as she said, "Santa's here." I smiled back at her, saying, "Yes, he is." I told her she better be quiet and hurry back to her room so that Santa doesn't find out she's awake. She giggled and said okay, and walked out of my room, leaving the door open. I laid back down and tried to get back to sleep. A couple minutes later, I heard some shuffling around downstairs. I sighed because I knew Kelsey probably went down there to open her presents early, which is what she did the year before. I reluctantly got up and walked towards the stairs. As I started clomping down the stairs, the noises I was hearing ceased. I got to the bottom step and I was in the living room by the tree. The lights on the tree were still on, I guess because it was Christmas Eve night. All the presents seemed to still be there, so Kelsey wasn't going through them after all. Still, I walked around the living room and dining room whispering her name just to see if she was hiding somewhere. I gave up and went back up the stairs. I was about to go to my wife and I's room when I decided I'd step into Kelsey's room just to check if she was in there. And she was. She was sitting up in her bed, wide awake. I asked her why she went downstairs when I told her to go to bed. She whispered excitedly, "It wasn't me. Santa's down there." I tried to begin a sentence, but stuttered, then froze. I ran down the stairs and turned on the lights, looking around the whole house. Then I found that the back door was open. Nobody locked it. Someone had broken into our house on Christmas Eve night, right under our noses, and stole a few of the presents left under the tree, according to my wife. The worst part about this is I heard whoever was down there. In fact, my 7-year-old daughter did too. Hell, she even came into my room and basically gave me a warning. It still kills me to this day.
I'm a single mother of my 8-year-old boy Mark. When this happened, he was 5 and I was 27. I have my own house that was passed down to me from my grandparents. It's in the quiet side of town with a lot of older people, and I still live here with Mark today. It was Christmas time, and I was out with Mark shopping. I was doing my Christmas shopping for my family. Mark and I went to the mall, including a few clothing stores and a hardware store where I bought a gift for my dad. After all the shopping was done, I took Mark to McDonald's to get him some burgers and ice cream. Afterwards, we left the mall through the south exit, and here we bumped into a mall Santa standing outside. He waved at us and said the usual Santa stuff. He then knelt down to get to Mark's level and asked him what he wanted for Christmas. Mark led my hand closer to the Santa, and I allowed it because he seemed like a normal, nice mall Santa. Mark said he wanted a Nintendo Switch, which ironically was what I was planning on buying him for Christmas. The Santa laughed and said, "If you're good, maybe you'll get it," while looking up at me and winking. I smiled, and then he stood up and started complimenting me, saying to Mark, "Your mother's a looker, Mark, you know that?" And Mark laughed, even though he didn't know what that meant. I still smiled. Then we had a couple minutes worth of seemingly friendly adult conversation about the holiday mayhem and such. The guy said he worked for the mall. I regrettably mentioned the stress of being a single mom during Christmas is unfathomable, and then I made a joke about needing Santa's help. Then the Santa made what I thought was an innocent joke, saying, "Mark, have you ever heard the song, 'I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus'?" And Mark shook his head yes. Then he leaned in towards me with his cheek, implying he wanted me to kiss his cheek. I was going to give him an innocent little peck on the fake beard, but as I leaned in, he turned his head and tried doing that old trick where he kisses you on the lips instead. I moved my face away in time. The way he did it was so creepy and aggressive too. He looked at me and started doing the Santa kind of laugh, but there was nothing jolly about it. I said, "Come on, Mark," and we started walking away. He yelled "Merry Christmas," and that was the last thing I heard him say. As we drove away past the back exit of the mall, I noticed he wasn't there in front of the entrance anymore. I wish I took that into consideration as to what may have happened next. We got home, and after bringing everything inside, I locked the door, and Mark and I started to watch a Christmas movie. Our wholesome time together was then interrupted. My doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was late for any kind of door-to-door people. I told Mark to keep watching as I went to go answer the door. I said, "Who is it?" through the door, and a man's voice on the other side said, "It's Santa." My heart dropped. I said, "If you're the mall Santa, please go away or I'm calling the cops." He replied, "You dropped something out of your bag, miss. I'm just looking to return it." I replied, "What did I drop?" He replied, "I don't know, miss. I'm not looking to be nosy, but if you open the door, I can hand it to you." I repeated myself that I wanted him to leave now. I then decided to call the mall management office of the mall to report this, but the man on the phone said they don't officially hire any mall Santas at this mall, and that whoever's dressing as Santa is doing it on their own accord. With that bit of information, I felt incredibly unsafe. I went back to be with Mark, but my mind was elsewhere now. I felt this sickly, worried feeling in my gut. I made an excuse to get up again after a few minutes. I went to the kitchen out of earshot of the TV. I raised the blinds to the kitchen window. I couldn't see anything out there, being that the kitchen light was on and it was pitch black outside. But I heard a man yelling, "Ho, ho, ho." He was probably out there watching me at that very moment, looking out the window. I had no choice but to call the police and report that I was followed by a man dressed as Santa. I told Mark to keep watching the movie, and I spoke to the police outside. They took a report and were on their way. The police having come made me feel just a little better. A few nights later, though, my doorbell rang again, around the same time, if not a little later. Mark was already asleep tonight. I was in the living room watching a show. I turned off the TV and went upstairs to my room, which is connected to Mark's room. The doorbell didn't ring again, but I never went back downstairs that night. It wasn't until the next day when I was leaving the house that I found the note taped to my front door. It was typed out and printed. This is a picture of the note, and it said, "I'll just be blunt. I'm sure you can guess who this is. I didn't mean to scare you the other night. I just had a long shift, and when a pretty lady talks to you after pretending to be Santa for 6 hours, hormones kind of go crazy. You and your son are the cutest things ever, and I'd love to one day be a part of your family. You can't pretend you didn't feel the connection when we spoke the other night. I already know where you live, now I just need your number. Feel free to shoot me a text whenever, and maybe we can plan something one day." Sorry, I know this may seem creepy or a bit much, but I'm the kind of guy where if I see something I like, I go after it. Anyway, happy holidays if we don't speak soon. Here's my number. Best, Ted. I wanted to crumple this up, but I took a picture of it, called the police again, and gave this to them. Since it had his number on it, the police could work with that. They said I'd be hearing from someone when action was taken, and that following Monday, I got a call from, I assume, a detective telling me that the man would not be contacting me anymore, and if he did, to let him know. I never heard from that creep again. I assume the police threatened to arrest him if there was any further contact. This is a short but scarring story nonetheless from my early childhood. I grew up in an average middle-class home in the suburbs. My sister and I were huge fans of Christmas as kids. I had to be like 6 years old when this happened, because we had just moved to our new house. This is one of my earliest memories in life that I remember vividly just because of the gravity of it. On Christmas Eve, I would always have trouble sleeping, even as a young kid, just due to anticipation. I would stay up really late playing video games in my room on my old box TV. I'd play until I just fell asleep from exhaustion. This night in question, I was playing a Star Wars game for the PS1, and when I had to go to the bathroom, I turned the volume down low and quietly snuck out of my room, because I knew my mom would get mad if she heard me sneaking around on Christmas Eve night. I snuck to the upstairs bathroom, and when I was done, I was quietly going back to my room, when I heard the sound of the tree rustling around downstairs. My first instinct was to think, Santa. I started tiptoeing down the stairs until I got to the bottom. The sound of the rustling pine needles was louder now. I peeked around the bottom wall of the stairway into the living room. There were no lights on, except for someone holding a flashlight. I could see only the person's legs as they were bent over behind the tree. There was a black bag on the floor, and this random adult man came out from behind the tree and looked at me. He looked at me and put his pointer finger up to his mouth, and he made a shushing motion with his lips. He whispered, "Yes, I'm Santa." I was old enough and smart enough to know that wasn't what the Santa I grew up knowing looked like. I started screaming for my mom and dad as loud as I could. I remember the man started freaking out, deciding whether or not to take the bag he filled with our gifts, and he ended up running away to the front door. I don't remember if he had to unlock it or if it was already unlocked or not. I just remember him leaving through the front door, and seconds later my parents running down the stairs. I'm sure I screamed there was a man in here, and them seeing the black bag on the floor filled with our would-have-been stolen gifts proved that. Here's where my memories started getting fuzzy, so I had to ask my parents what happened next. But my dad told me he went outside in his slippers and ran all over the place ready to kill someone. Half the ornaments on the tree were taken off and in the bag. What kind of sick, evil person steals people's sentimental Christmas ornaments? According to my dad, the method in which the man broke in was the back door, which it appeared he yanked open with a crowbar due to the chipped wood. A house a few blocks away had also fallen victim to this, and it was on the news. It was most definitely the same guy. I don't remember much from when I was 6, but this is a memory that most of it still sticks in my brain like it was only a few years ago. It was December 2020. My fiancé and I bought a house together a few years ago. It's a cute house in a decent neighborhood, a nice area to raise a family. That's why what happened 2 years ago was all the more shocking and disgusting. We know all of our neighbors, both our next door neighbors and the 3 closest neighbors across the street. Everyone is friendly enough, but you truly never know the skeletons hidden in someone's closet. Our neighbor Paul to the right always seemed nice the few times we'd speak, but he never really spoke too much. I'd see him outside almost every day, either coming or leaving for, I'm assuming, work, though I never knew what he did for a living. At this time, I hadn't seen the guy in a few days, and his car hadn't moved from his driveway. Obviously, that in of itself isn't any cause for alarm. All of the neighbors, including Paul, had their lights up already. I found it interesting how Paul, a single man in his 40s, would put lights up. I actually found it kind of nice. I was late to the party putting my Christmas lights and decorations up outside one night. While doing so, I noticed Paul's Christmas lights out of nowhere started flickering like crazy. All of them, not just one strip of lights. It looked like it could have just been faulty wiring or some electrical glitch. The next day, I left for work around 10 and noticed again Paul's car was still in the driveway. I also noticed all the blinds in his house were still closed. Even when I got back from work, the blinds were all closed, but his Christmas lights were on, so he was definitely home. I joked with my fiancée that he must have been on some kind of hibernation. Later that night, my fiancée came inside and told me of Paul's Christmas lights acting up. I went outside and it was the exact same thing that was happening the night before. The flickering wasn't happening in a way that would appear that he programmed it that way. It was happening in a very spastic, glitchy sort of way. So I figured I'd be nice and go let him know, and also see if he's okay since I hadn't seen him. I knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, I rang. All the blinds were closed and I couldn't tell if the lights were on or not. When there was no answer, I rang one more time. Finally, the door opened and Paul greeted me. I let him know about his flickering lights, which I just noticed weren't flickering anymore. I promised him I wasn't making it up. He said he wasn't aware of that and thanked me. I asked if he was alright as I hadn't seen him in a while. He said he was just feeling under the weather. He was acting a bit off. Then I heard something from inside the house. At first I thought I was imagining it, but it sounded like a child screaming for help. Paul didn't have any kids. I was about to ask him, "Did you hear that?" But on the spot I decided not to. I said goodbye and walked back to my house. Then I told my fiancée to call the police right now. I think Paul has a child in his house. Her reaction was literally, "What did you say?" I said, "I think Paul kidnapped a child." So I called the police and said I think I heard a child screaming inside my neighbor's house. My neighbor who doesn't have kids and hasn't been leaving his house the past week or two. I asked to keep who made the call anonymous, though I knew Paul wouldn't be so stupid as to not know it was me who made the call. Sure enough, the police arrived and entered his house on exigency, and when I heard what they found, I was appalled. There was a young boy locked in the basement. He had been locked down there for 4 days. The boy had been kidnapped from a completely different town. As far as the flickering lights, the boy was a genius and somehow found a way from the basement to flicker the Christmas lights as an attempt to call for help and get someone's attention outside, probably whenever he saw someone through one of the blocked off basement windows. I reckon he saw his chance to call for help when someone, me, was at the front door. Clearly a very smart kid with great survival instincts. I'm glad he was reunited with his family. I don't want to know what was done to him, but I hope he lives a normal life and has put this behind him. Knowing how serious of a crime child kidnapping is, Paul won't be getting out of prison anytime soon. I was home alone one weekend, so my girlfriend Jenny came over to spend the weekend with me. It was the middle of December, and Christmas festivities were in full swing. Jenny wanted to watch Christmas movies tonight, so we ordered food, drank wine, and sat by the Christmas tree in the living room watching Christmas movies. We started with The Polar Express, then we started watching Elf. We ran out of wine, so I decided I'd run to the liquor store down the block to get more. It would only take 10 minutes anyway. It was a Saturday night, so they were open later. The usual cashier was working, and I got stuck in a conversation with him like I always do whenever I go there. Mid-conversation with him, I felt my phone vibrating in my pocket. I checked my phone to see it was Jenny. I interrupted the cashier saying 1 sec, and I picked up. Jenny sounded scared, saying she keeps hearing noises from below the living room. That would mean the crawl space. I told her it's fine, there's nothing down there. She asked me to stay on the phone with her until I got back, so I did. I walked the 5-minute walk back home and Jenny was still on the couch. She had the movie paused still, saying that she was listening for sounds. When I asked her if she heard any other sounds, she said no. She asked what if there's an animal down there. I told her that's not possible as there's no openings from anywhere outside. I opened the wine bottle and we continued to watch the movie. It wasn't long after that we both heard a distinct thud type of sound from below us, from the crawl space. I looked at Jenny and she looked at me. She was right, there was something down there. I said, oh shit, there might actually be an animal down there. Once again, we paused the movie and I went to the closet with the attic door inside. I grabbed the flashlight on the ledge and went down into the crawl space. I stayed by the crawl space door and just did a quick scan of the place. There are a million boxes down there, so a small animal could have been hiding anywhere. It smelled like piss in there, which pretty much confirmed that there was something down there. I'm not an exterminator or pest control, so there was nothing I could do about it. I told my parents about it in the family group chat and told my dad he'd have to call pest control tomorrow. Then, as I was climbing back up the stairs, I heard something from across the crawl space. I don't know what it was, but something moved. I got scared that some animal was going to run at me, so I hurried up the stairs and shut the door. There wasn't much else we could do now except just go back to the living room and finish watching the movie. After Elf ended, we went to my room and eventually went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night having to pee really badly and with a throbbing headache. I got up and opened my bedroom door and looked down into the dark hallway. At the end of the hallway, I saw a person's silhouette. I almost screamed, but instead I closed the door quietly and locked it. I heard footsteps coming down the hallway, and then the doorknob turned and someone tried opening the door. And then a deep, hoarse-sounding voice on the other side said, "Hello?" That was when Jenny started to scream. She had been woken up by my getting up, and she heard the voice too. I would have tried to calm her down, but I was scared shitless myself. I did hear footsteps walk away from the door, and so I called 911. Waiting for the cops felt like a millennium. All I know is when the cops got here, there was no one else in this house. Whoever it was left. The smell of piss in the crawl space wasn't my imagination. There was literally a puddle of that person's piss on the ground, which is pretty disturbing because that would suggest that he had been down there for a while. While it was likely a homeless squatter, that didn't make it any less horrifying. My family didn't even believe it at first. I've never forgotten to lock the door ever again. When I was newly single after my 2-year relationship ended, I was back to living alone again, and back to swiping on Tinder and all those apps. I had been single for a few months already, and I had met a few people in that time. During that time, I matched a girl on Tinder named Tracy, and she gave me her Snapchat, but it quickly fizzled out to her just watching my stories and not really communicating. That kinda used to happen all the time when I was in college. But now being in my late 20s, using Tinder, and just being reminded of how immature all this online dating stuff is, it feels a lot different at this age. I own a corner townhome in a little community. If you're wondering what I do, I'm an accountant. Good money, but miserably boring. After my ex moved out, I thought I would be ready for the privacy and peace and quiet, but I'd say after the first month, the novelty of that wore off. Maybe I'm more of a relationship person, or I just need people around, but being alone was getting to me. That's why I was constantly swiping on dating apps and trying to go on dates, just to get out of the house. This was last December. I posted something on my Snap story that had to do with Christmas, and guess who commented on my story? It was that Tracy girl who I hadn't spoken to in weeks. She struck up a conversation about us doing some Christmas-themed stuff together, and from there we started chatting for a bit. I suggested the most festive things I could think of. Ice skating, going to the village, and looking at the decorations, but she suggested we decorate my Christmas tree. Firstly, I did have a fake tree, but it was up in the attic. So I told her I didn't have it up yet because it's kind of a 2-person job getting it out of the attic. She said she'd gladly come over and help, so I figured why not. I told her to come over around 9 that night. It was already dark at that point when we made the plan. It was likely like 7:30 because I remember hurriedly grabbing my keys and rushing to drive to the liquor store to buy a couple bottles of wine. When I got back to the house, I vacuumed and swept the floors. Ever since my breakup, the things my girlfriend would do to clean the place were left to me, and I realized how quickly a place can get dirty. 9 p.m. rolled around, and I was low-key sitting upright on the couch with the TV on, pretending like I was just chilling in the living room watching a movie already. Meanwhile, I had set everything up to be cozy and relaxing. But I sat there for a while, waiting on her to message me or for the doorbell. I sent a follow-up saying, "Let me know when you're on your way," and I eventually started to think she was flaking, until finally around 9:30, when she said she's outside. She came inside, and I was shocked to find that I was looking up at her. She was a couple inches taller than me. I'm 5'10", so she had to be at least 6 feet tall. I also immediately picked up on the fact that she smelled like she was drenched in perfume. We went straight to the couch and sat down, and she sat really, really close to me, like our legs were touching. This is where I started to get confused in how exactly I was feeling. She looked a bit older, maybe a little rougher, I'm not sure how to explain it. And underneath that overpowering smell of cheap-smelling perfume, I couldn't help but feel like there was a slight hint of body odor, which completely turned me off. I asked her if she wanted wine, and she said yes please. So I went and poured a couple glasses as we talked. Have you ever met someone for the first time that you'd been texting or DMing for a while, and when you finally meet, they just end up being nothing like you pictured in your head? That was pretty much this. Something about her felt off, like she lacked certain social cues. I handed her a glass of Merlot and we cheers each other. I shit you not, she almost immediately spilled a huge drop of red wine on my light blue couch. I composed myself, but I wanted to scream. I said it's okay, as I ran to the kitchen to get a damp paper towel and sponge. I ran back to the couch and blotted it as quickly as I could before it would settle. She kept apologizing, and I kept saying it was okay. After this, it got a little more tense, and to break the tension, I suggested I get the tree out of the attic. So I went up to the attic, slid over the giant box with all the tree parts in it, and started handing her down the pieces one by one, each piece getting bigger until we got to the biggest part, the part that I wouldn't be able to handle going down the ladder on my own. She grabbed it with ease. I had to remember this girl's size. Once everything was handed down, I went back down and we assembled the tree in the living room with Christmas music playing. I poured her more wine and I drank more myself. I loosened up a bit more. Wine makes any situation feel better. Once we had the tree set up, next was the ornaments. I told her my ornaments were all in the crawl space. These ornaments were all from my childhood. My parents gave me bins and bins of Christmas decorations. So I went down to the crawl space and one by one started taking out the bins, while I left Tracy in the living room to relax. As I was doing all of this, I started feeling woozy, like the wine was getting to my head. I've never been a heavy drinker, so I do have a low tolerance, but I felt like I hadn't drank that much to feel this way. I grabbed the first bin and started lugging it up the stairs. By the time I got to the top, Tracy wasn't anywhere in sight. I assumed she was in the bathroom at first and called her name. I looked around each room and then saw that the bathroom was empty. I scratched my head in confusion as I kept calling her name. I went to message her on Snap, but she never opened the Snap. I checked the 2 bedrooms too, but she was gone. I couldn't believe this. She snuck out on me. This was when I started wondering if she thought I was ugly or weird or something, even though truthfully, I wasn't even really into her either. I crashed onto the couch, which suddenly felt a lot more comfortable than before, and honestly, as far as I remember, I periodically checked my phone to see if she opened my Snap, and just watched whatever was on TV, until my memory just faded to black. I swear, everything just went black. And then, I woke up in darkness. No lights, no TV on. I looked around in the dark room, and I knew I was hearing things. I felt like I was still on the couch, and I felt weak. My limbs were hard to move, but I managed to find my phone right under me within seconds, and I checked the time. The second the phone screen lit up, I saw it. Even though the light was facing toward me, that glow from my phone screen with the brightness all the way up revealed the outline of a tall person's silhouette standing in front of me. For some reason, I didn't scream. I just put the phone down, bringing the room back to darkness. I finally opened my mouth to say, "Tracy, hoping it was her, but still not in that moment remembering what had happened earlier. Whoever was standing there didn't answer me. I eventually picked my phone back up and turned on the flashlight, and I saw that it was in fact Tracy standing in front of me. She wasn't moving, she was just looking down at me. I felt locked to the couch. I don't know if it was because of pure fear or the effects of whatever she had obviously laced me with. I genuinely was having a hard time moving my limbs. I felt weak and helpless. All I could manage to say was Tracy a couple more times. She turned towards the stairs, and again, I swear, she sprinted toward them, and all I heard were the disturbingly loud stomps of her running down the stairs. I heard something slam from downstairs. Looking back, I'd imagine it was the front door. Everything looked and sounded so wonky in those minutes after I woke up. Each passing minute, I felt more and more clear-headed, and moving became easier. I checked Snapchat to see that her account was gone, aka she blocked me. I looked out the front window and saw no cars outside besides my own and the neighbors. And then I realized I never saw the vehicle that she arrived in, or if she even arrived in one. I checked my entire home from top to bottom, checking for anything that could have been stolen. The only items I found missing seemed kind of bizarre at first, but honestly made so much sense soon after. Every last bottle of pills from my house was gone. All my vitamins and supplements, my bottles of Adderall, and even the bottle of Oxy that I had prescribed but never fully used after a surgery, those were in the drawer next to my bed. I noticed a bottle of vodka was taken from my mini fridge in my room too, but other than that, I didn't see anything else that could have been stolen. Still, I called the police right then and reported the robbery. I gave the Snapchat username and explained that I never got her number or knew anything really about her identity minus the name that she gave me, which was Tracy Gibson. The police knocked on my neighbor's door since all of our homes are attached, even though it was like 1 a.m. With me standing next to them, they questioned if he'd seen or heard anything strange, to which he said no, he'd been asleep. After about 20 minutes, the police left. I made sure all of my keys were still in place so as to make sure she couldn't get back in, but other than that, this Tracy person disappeared without a trace. I knew her behavior was quirky and wonky from the first few minutes of meeting her, and it makes so much sense now. I won't even call it a theory because I just know this is the truth. I think that girl, or woman I should say, was older than she claimed, and she was potentially homeless with a serious drug addiction. I think she drowned herself in perfume to mask the body odor that was honestly still showing through. She laced my wine with something when I was in the attic clearly. I don't know exactly how long I was out, but it was enough for her to scour my entire home for any and all drugs and supplements. I still remember how disturbing of an image it was seeing her tall silhouette standing in front of me while I was just waking up on the couch. Honestly, after this, I didn't even decorate the tree that year. This happened on Christmas Eve back in '97 when I was 7 years old. Since we're Jewish, we don't celebrate Christmas, so Christmas Eve was just like any other night for us. Our dad is a doctor, and since he's Jewish, he always works on call at the hospital during the Christmas holidays, so he wasn't home tonight. That just left my little sister and I by ourselves for the evening while our dad worked. Technically, our mom was home, but to be blunt, she was an alcoholic. Back then, being a 7-year-old, I had no idea what alcoholism was. All I knew was that my mom was always passed out once it got dark and near impossible to wake up. Sorry if it sounds harsh or TMI, but it's relevant to my story. My sister and I were downstairs watching TV when we heard a knock at the door. Being the oldest, I went to see who it was. Our door had glass panes built into it, which made it easy to see who was on the other side. There was a man standing outside in a Santa suit holding a bag, and when he saw me, he smiled and waved at me to come to the door. I went near the door but did not open it, and I thought it was odd that someone dressed like Santa would come to our house out of anyone's house in the neighborhood. He said, "Hey kid, it's me Santa. Let me in, I'll give you your presents." I remember point blank telling him that Santa isn't real, and that if he was, he doesn't give Jews presents anyway. That's when he said, "Of course I'm real. In the past, I only used to visit Christian homes, but lately, I felt bad that Jewish kids never get any presents. So this year, I changed the rules so that you can get presents too." But I didn't buy it. And instead, I remember getting mad at him, arguing that Jews get presents. We just get them during Hanukkah and not on Christmas. The smile fell from his face, and all his jolly charm disappeared as he began demanding I open the door. I told my sister to dial 911, and the guy seemed to run away. We did call the cops. However, unfortunately, the operator didn't understand what we were saying. Looking back, I think she may have thought we were just little kids excited that Santa Claus was coming to our house. Regardless, she didn't take us seriously, and instead just told us that this number was to be used for emergencies only before disconnecting the call. My sister and I now got really scared because we didn't know who else to call. Since we were only 4 and 7, the only numbers we knew how to dial were our home number and 911. And since this is the 90s, my dad didn't have a cell phone yet, and I had no idea what the hospital number was to reach him there. And with our mom impossible for us to wake up, we were essentially on our own. We hoped the man wouldn't come back, but a few minutes later, he was knocking on the door again. He said he knew the cops weren't coming and to go ahead and let him in or we'd be in big trouble. My sister started crying and ran upstairs trying to wake my mom. Not knowing what else to do, I did the one thing that made sense to my 7-year-old brain. I grabbed a bunch of candles we keep for our menorah and lit them all, then ran below where the smoke detector was. I blew out all the candles quickly before tossing them all up to the smoke detector. Thankfully, they gave off enough smoke to set off the smoke alarm. As an adult, I realized how stupid this was, and fortunately, I did not accidentally set the house on fire. But at that time, all I knew was that the smoke alarm would instantly call 911 for me and send help to our home. There was a fire department not even 2 minutes from our house, so they got here pretty fast. My sister came downstairs, scared of the fire alarm, but I told her there was no fire and to not go outside, but instead wait inside with me. To my amazement, the guy still did not leave. Instead, the bastard ran to the firefighters, presumably telling them that he was glad they showed up. I remember that he claimed he was my dad, and that he dressed up like Santa Claus for Christmas Eve to surprise us. He explained that his suit didn't have any pockets to hold his keys, and that with the door locked, he couldn't get the door open to save us from the fire, so he begged the firefighters to break down the door, and surprisingly, the firefighters seemed to believe him. They were actually getting ready to break down the door, and told us to stand back, but we started crying, shouting at them that he's not our dad, that our dad is working at the hospital, and that we have no idea who this guy was, and that we don't even celebrate Christmas. The firefighter who was about to break down the door thankfully stopped and listened to us. He asked, "You don't celebrate Christmas?" I told him no because we're Jewish, and showed him my kippah on my head as well as our menorah. I then broke down crying, explaining how I set off the smoke alarm to try and get help because the police wouldn't believe us, and to please not let the guy in. The firefighter thankfully believed me, and then asked the guy why Santa would show up to a Jewish home. I don't remember exactly what the guy said, but the firefighters clearly didn't believe him. 2 of them wrestled the guy to the ground while the other called the police to come by. They also asked what hospital my dad worked at so they could let him know what was going on. The police arrived and arrested the guy, while another officer stayed with us until my dad came home and explained the situation to him. My dad was furious with our mom for being wasted and essentially sleeping through the whole thing, but mostly he was grateful that we were okay. As far as Christmases go, I was glad to have our usual boring and quiet Christmas the following year. To this day, I think being Jewish saved my sister and I's lives, because had we opened that door to let Santa in, there's a good chance that would have been our final Christmas. It was December 2022. My girlfriend Charlotte and I were driving to the Pocono Mountains. We had rented a super cozy looking Airbnb decked out with Christmas decorations, and it was nicely located with a nice view, big property, and not far from a cute little village. To make things even more festive feeling, there was a snowstorm coming that night, so we set out on the road a little earlier to allow us time to get groceries and everything set up in the Airbnb. From the city to the Poconos was about 4 hours. We made decent time. We stopped at a Family Dollar for some snacks and groceries, and then we went straight to the Airbnb. We turned towards the uphill gravel road through a clearing in the trees that led to the property. The house was surrounded by woods. It had a big deck with a hot tub on it, which was very appealing, especially the idea of sitting in it during a snowstorm. There were a bunch of Christmas decorations on the property, including some light-up reindeer, a big snowman, and big decorative candy canes lining the walkway to the front deck. We had to take a few trips to and from the car to bring everything inside. First impression, the place had a very comfy feeling as we expected from the pictures. It had a Christmas tree in one corner, stockings hung on the walls, and a bunch of smaller decorations scattered about. It had that very welcoming smell of wood that you'd expect in a country log cabin, though it was more so just a regular house. Then I realized why. There was a stack of logs next to a big fireplace in the living room. There were 3 bedrooms, though of course we only needed 1. We put our luggage and such in a second bedroom. I did the usual stuff like inspect the fridge, turn on the TV to see if there's cable or Netflix, and look out all the windows. There was an upstairs, but it was more of a loft with a pool table and a couple of couches. Then there was a basement. For the hell of it, I went down to check out the basement. It was fairly big relative to the size of the house. It felt disconnected from the Airbnb though. It wasn't furnished for hanging out in. It was dark and cold and felt more like a space to do laundry and a workspace. Then there was a knock at the front door. I hurried up to answer it, and there was a guy who looked to be in his late 40s. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a ripped up yellowish brown jacket. He smiled at me and said, "How are you folks doing?" I replied good and asked him if he was the Airbnb host. He replied he runs the place with his brother. I asked for his name and he said Tom. Tom said he lives just up the road next door if my girl and I need anything. I thanked him and then he walked away. I found it interesting that he knew I was with my girlfriend. Charlotte didn't come to the door, but maybe his brother told him about us. I did have a conversation with Mike the host about it being my girlfriend and I wanting to do something festive. It was pitch black out and it was snowing. We cranked up the heat in the house and started preparing the dinner we bought, which was chicken thighs, broccoli, potatoes, and cornbread. It was pretty grab bag. We ate on the couch with the Christmas tree lights on in the corner, giving the room a nice comfy glow as we watched the Polar Express. It was the only good Christmas movie on any of the streaming platforms. If you can't tell, we really love Christmas. After the movie, and when we felt we had digested enough, we went outside to the deck to hop in the hot tub. I turned on all the decorations and Christmas lights in the front yard, and as we sat in the hot tub watching the snow fall, it felt like bliss, until the bubbles on the hot tub stopped and it went silent, and we heard unmistakable footsteps from somewhere on the property. Charlotte and I looked at one another. I asked her if I should shout who's there, but she said no. The footsteps moved further and further until they were no longer audible. I told Charlotte it was probably a deer, but deep down, I knew those were the footsteps of a person. After the hot tub, we went to take a shower before bed. The hot water in the shower didn't last for more than maybe 2 minutes though. Something was wrong. When the water turned ice cold, we screamed and jumped out of the shower. I messaged Mike the host about it. He responded within half an hour saying that's odd and that he'll have a guy come and look at the hot water heater tomorrow. We went to sleep after our half shower. In the middle of the night though, we awoke to very aggressive bangs on the front door of the house. Charlotte was shaking me, terrified. I said I'm gonna check who it is, but she demanded I stay in the bed and don't make a sound. Honestly, I was glad she said that. No part of me wanted to know who was at the door in the middle of the night. I think there were 3 sets of really loud and angry sounding bangs before they stopped. We sat upright for a few minutes in silence, whispering to each other. I went over to lock the bedroom door for added security, I guess. Minutes dragged along, but ultimately, after about half an hour of sitting wide awake, we eventually drifted back off to sleep. First thing in the morning, I messaged Mike again about the knocks at the door. He answered more quickly this time, seeming pretty confused like us. He basically said how strange that is. He didn't know why anyone would be roaming around late at night like that. He said if anything like that happens again, that we should alert the authorities. Honestly, not the most reassuring response, but I mean, he was right. What else could he tell us? Grab a gun and shoot whoever was at the door? I didn't want to keep complaining to Mike constantly, but I mean, these were some valid concerns I was bringing up to him. There was a lot of snow outside, and it was a dark, cloudy day. There were still some flurries falling onto the ground. I went out to wipe the snow off my Jeep, and while I was doing so, I noticed footsteps in the snow. They looped around the house. I remembered the knocks from the night before, and wondered if it was from the same person. But these footprints looked fresh, and it snowed all night. Surely the footprints from last night would have filled in by now. I heard footsteps approaching now, actually, and I saw Tom walking from around my car. I told him about the hot water heater problem, and that Mike said they were sending someone to take a look at it. He said he knew and that he was here to take a look at it, actually. I also told him about the knocks at the door last night and the footprints in the snow. I even showed him. He looked at them and said there's a lot of strange folk out here that go snooping around at night. I asked if we should refrain from using the hot tub at night then, and he said no, that shouldn't be a problem. The people around here are harmless. He went inside into the house and walked around for a bit before walking down to the basement. He told me he'll have a look at the hot water heater. Tom seems like a weird dude, honestly. I messaged Mike saying Tom's here now checking out the water heater. Mike replied back asking, is Tom the name of the plumber? And I replied, no, your brother. He replied, what do you mean? He said he's my brother? It started to click in my head. I responded, do you have a brother named Tom who runs this Airbnb with you? And he replied, no, who is this person? I hurried to Charlotte and told her to collect her things quietly. We need to get out of here. As quickly as we could, we packed our bags, grabbed all of our stuff, and brought it outside to the car in one trip. I'm sure we left behind a charger or something small, but who cares? We got in my car, and when I started it, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Tom quickly approaching the rear of the Jeep. I put it in drive and drove out of there as quickly as I could. When we were back on the road, we called Mike and explained everything and told him he needs to call the police now. He didn't stay on the line with us for long, but 20 minutes later, he called us back. We were in the car still. He said the police were there now and didn't see anyone in the house. Mike was on his way to the house as well, but he was mostly calling to get more details from us. We drove around the area and explored just as a way to calm our nerves after what just happened. After a few hours, we drove home. Mike messaged me later that night updating me and apologizing for everything. He said he didn't know anyone who resembled my description of Tom. What disturbs me is that man was watching us the entire time, from the moment we arrived to when we were in the hot tub, and he was probably the one banging on the front door in the middle of the night. Who knows what his intentions were? It's a good thing we left when we did, though. It was Christmas Eve night. We always hosted Christmas Eve at our house when I was a kid. My grandparents, uncles, and my cousins would always come. This year I must have been like 12. My mom was making duck, as she always did on Christmas Eve. I was helping her cook and prepare this year because my dad actually had a really bad cold and was trying to not touch anything or stay too close to anyone. Our family slowly started showing up one by one. My Uncle Joe first with my cousins Chris and Valerie. They were the closest in age to me, so I've always been closest with them out of all my cousins. As soon as they got there, I got distracted from helping out my mom, because Chris brought over a video game for my PlayStation that I'd been wanting to play, Driver 2. We ran upstairs to my room to put the disc in and play, and Valerie came just to watch. But within a few minutes, my mom called my name up the stairs angrily, ruining the fun. I was hoping she'd just let me play, but she was already stressed from the amount of work that cooking and preparing for a big family is. So we had to resume playing the game later. We left it on pause, and all three of us went back downstairs. Most family had arrived already. I was juggling saying hi to everybody while helping set up the table and stuff. Within half an hour, the whole family was there, and dinner was almost ready. The table was already set, and half the family was already at the dinner table, including myself. Then I remembered my mom yelling, "Ah, shit." She yelled for me to run to the basement to grab the stuffing, which she forgot to make. Our house didn't have an actual pantry closet, so my mom used the backside of the bar in the basement as a pantry. I went down to the basement to fetch the stuffing. I was behind the bar looking for the damn stuff, when I noticed a blanket covering something in the corner next to the two sofas. At first glance, I assumed it was a person, one of my cousins hiding, trying to scare me. As I walked a little closer, I could confirm it was a person based on the shape of what was underneath the blanket. I could see the person's head. I stood there waiting to see if they'd react to my not making noise. I was wondering how he or she would know when to jump out to scare me if they couldn't see me under that blanket. Suddenly the lights to the basement turned off, and I heard the basement door slam shut. I yelled "screw you" to whoever it was, Valerie or Chris. I knew it was one of them, not my older cousins. I was going to scare whoever was under the blanket. I had a feeling the two of them were trying to mess with me, but now the joke was on them. I was going to scare whoever was under that blanket. I tiptoed on the carpet to the corner of the room and yanked the blanket off whoever it was and started screaming to scare them. But instead of hearing one of my cousin's childish screams, I heard nothing. Then a very strong grip grabbed me. Whoever it was went for my neck as soon as they felt where it was in the dark. For a few seconds I thought it was Chris roughhousing me, and I was screaming at him to stop, but this felt like the grip of a grown man. I started to scream for my life with whatever air was able to escape my lungs. The door to the basement opened and the light turned on, revealing an old, dirty, disheveled-looking man. He let me go and ran to the basement door which led to the backyard, not the basement door that led to the upstairs. Half my family came rushing down. I was crying and screaming he went that way, pointing at the open backyard basement door. Two of my uncles ran outside to try to find him, while my mom and aunts came to my side to try to comfort me as I was crying. I was literally shook. My whole body was shaking and I felt ill. My mother called the police to report this. My uncles were out in the streets for like 20 minutes looking from house to house for the man. It made no sense because it didn't look like he would have been able to make it too far, which makes me think he was hiding somewhere in the backyard or a neighbor's yard. The officer said it sounded like some homeless squatter hiding from the cold, and that they'd gotten a number of these calls that month. That didn't make things sound any better after that allegedly homeless man had his hand around my neck. My cousins were trying to pull a prank on me, hence why they turned the light off and shut the door originally. But this was obviously not part of their plan. So my family learned a valuable lesson at my horrifying expense. Always keep every single entrance to your house locked at all times. It was Christmas Eve night. I was a little kid. My dad was briefly dating this woman named Sydney. My mom died when I was really young, so for most of my childhood, I didn't know what it was like having a motherly figure in the house. When my dad started seeing Sydney, she would spend the weekends at our house once in a while, and my siblings and I liked that. Sydney always seemed like a decent woman, but I was a little kid, and I was perhaps biased because I just liked having a woman in the house. It was Christmas Eve. Sydney was spending the weekend with us for Christmas. I don't think she had much family herself. We watched the movie Elf as a family, my brother, sister, dad, and Sydney. After the movie ended, my dad and Sydney went to bed. I stayed up with my brother a little later to watch the Polar Express. Around the time the movie ended, Sydney came downstairs to tell us that it's maybe time to go to sleep. I was young, but I was old enough to be suspicious about Santa Claus by now, and I had a feeling it was always my dad putting the gifts under the tree. I went to my room to play video games for a few hours. I snuck out of my room around 12 o'clock to see if the presents were under the tree yet. My bedroom was the only bedroom on the den level, so every other bedroom was upstairs. The living room and tree were on the first level, a half flight of stairs above my bedroom. I snuck out of my room and tiptoed up the stairs. I peered into the living room, which was lit up by the Christmas tree. There were presents under there, and there was Sydney under the tree. At first I thought she was placing the gifts there, and I thought I was right all along, that Santa wasn't real. But I quickly realized she wasn't placing the gifts there. She was shaking them, like trying to figure out what's inside of the boxes. She picked up one gift which was in a gift bag, started digging through it, and pulled out something that looked like it was for my sister, like makeup. She analyzed it and put it back in the bag. I didn't know what she was doing, but I kept watching. I saw her walk to the kitchen and go to the ledge where my dad keeps his wallet. What I saw next, I couldn't believe. She went through my dad's wallet and took out a few bills and put it in the pocket of her pajama pants. I kept watching as she went into the cabinet above the ledge, the medicine cabinet. She took out what looked to be one of my dad's prescription medication bottles, and she started analyzing it. She opened it, sniffed it, and then looked to her left, right at me. It was as if she was about to do something very bad and was checking that the coast was clear first, and she saw me right away. Her eyes widened and she put the bottle back in the cabinet. I hurried down the stairs back to my room and crawled into bed, with my little kid mind thinking I somehow could still pretend to be asleep. Seconds later, the door creaked open and then shut. I didn't look, but I didn't know if she entered the room or not. A few minutes passed and I finally felt it was safe to check if she was gone. I looked up and Sydney was standing right over my bed. I gasped and almost screamed. She looked down at me. All I could see was the silhouette of her figure, making the sight of her even creepier. She said she saw me watching her, and said in this angry whisper that she wasn't doing anything wrong. She just wanted to make sure my dad was taking his medication. I replied okay, and she said Merry Christmas and left the room. The next day, after we opened gifts, my dad came into the living room angrily and said, "Who took $60 out of my wallet?" I looked at Sydney right away, who glanced back at me as if she knew that I knew. At that moment, I didn't tell my dad what I saw. But later that day, when my dad was still angry at my siblings and I thinking one of us did it, I told him the truth of what I saw. My dad didn't believe me at first, but when I told him that she was going through his medication too, he started to believe me because why would I lie about that? Later that night, this created for a rather loud conversation between the two of them. But shockingly, my dad didn't ask Sydney to leave. She didn't admit to stealing his money, and I think my dad simply didn't know what to do. That night, I had my bedroom door locked, which my dad always told us to never do, but I just felt safer with it locked that night, and thank God I did lock it, because around the same time as the night before, I heard the doorknob to my bedroom door jiggle a few times. It was undoubtedly her, which the next day I confirmed when I asked my dad if it was him, and he said no. After she left that night, I begged and pleaded my dad to not have her over anymore because she scared me, and it looked like she was going to do something to his medication. I'm grateful my dad listened to me because he stopped seeing Sydney shortly after that. I wonder what she was actually going to do to his medication if she didn't notice me watching her. Christmas night of 2021. It was a Saturday night. I went up to Vermont to be with my family for the holiday and stay with them for the weekend. I was staying there from Saturday, Christmas Day, to Monday. For Christmas Eve, I went with my girlfriend to her family's gathering. For actual Christmas, I'd be with mine. She didn't come with me, though. Our Christmas gathering wasn't huge, since our family's so spread out over the East Coast. It was my parents, my older brother, his girlfriend, my aunt and uncle, and myself. The house is big enough to accommodate all of us. We all did our family tradition of watching a movie together after dinner with the fireplace going. This year we watched Bad Santa, one of my dad's favorite Christmas movies. After the movie, we had pumpkin pie and ice cream, and afterwards played cards. Around 11, everyone started to get situated wherever they were sleeping. My brother and his girlfriend took one of the 2 spare bedrooms, and my aunt and uncle took the second. There was a nice pull-out couch in the living room that I'd be sleeping on, which I did not mind. I liked being able to sleep by the fireplace and tree. It was very cozy. I had the TV on as I was nodding off. When I felt that I was about to fall asleep, I turned off the TV and Christmas tree lights. The fire was breathing its last breaths, and the room was just about pitch black. My memory faded into a dream actually about Christmas and my family. Only in my dream, we weren't at my parents' house, we were at my uncle's house, and more of my family members were there, like my cousin Jackie and my aunt Melissa. It wasn't a very exciting or unusual dream. We were at the dinner table, when suddenly all of my family members in my dream stopped talking, turned and looked at me, and my aunt Melissa said in a very serious voice, "There's someone in the house, wake up." I actually woke up after this, and my heart was already racing for some reason. The way my dream ended genuinely disturbed me. I sat up and looked around the dark room, actually feeling uncomfortable. The super high ceiling of the living room made me feel even more exposed. I heard a creak in the floor where the kitchen and living room meet. I looked in that direction. The fire was completely out now. There was no light in the room. Yet I thought I could see a person standing right where the kitchen starts. I said, "Is someone there?" expecting one of my family members to answer back. They didn't. The silhouette-looking shadow in the doorway of the kitchen was still there, though. I sat up just a little more to look closer at the doorway. The silhouette then started moving. It was a person. "Who is that?" I said louder. Whoever it was went towards the back door, and I heard the back door close. I started screaming for my family to wake up, and everyone came out of their rooms. Everyone. So what I had just seen was none of my family members. So my dad, brother, uncle, and I threw on our shoes and coats and ran out into the cold looking around. We found a set of footprints in the snow leading into the woods. Mind you, it was like 2 in the morning, and the neighboring houses aren't exactly on top of each other, so none of us were exactly eager to go into the woods following some unknown person's footsteps. We instead called the police, and while we waited for them, my brother and I stood in the backyard watching the woods. The creepy pitch-black woods where someone was hiding, potentially looking back at us without our knowledge. Everyone else was inside, looking to see if anything was stolen, and surprisingly, nothing of serious value was missing. But also, it's not like my parents had jewelry or money just sitting out in the open on the first floor. The police officers who came followed the footprints into the woods as far as they could until the trail seemed to disappear or just became impossible to follow. They had not gotten any other calls regarding break-ins that night, at least not to that point. But the next day, nothing was on the news about any break-ins either. So it may have just been a one-off fluke thing where my parents' house happened to be the target of someone trying to steal valuables, like expensive Christmas presents potentially. I'll tell you one thing though, I had a rough time falling asleep that following night in that living room again. The image of that person in the doorway to the kitchen still haunts me.
This happened back at a magical, delicate age when I still believed in Santa Claus. It was Christmas Eve night, or technically Christmas at that point. The time, I have no idea. All I know is it was late and everyone in my house was probably asleep. I woke up randomly to what I don't know, but I was probably extremely thirsty. I had to get out of my bed and walk all the way downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. There were night lights on in the living room and kitchen, so I didn't have to turn on any lights to see where I was going. Whenever I was thirsty when I was a little kid, I'd always decide to finish the glass in the kitchen instead of bring it up to my room. I don't know why, just one of those stupid things I did as a kid. As I was sipping the water, I heard noises come from down in the den, where we had our Christmas tree. It sounded like a big bag. I peered my head around the wall leading down the stairway to the den, but it was a little too dark to see who could be down there. I actually thought maybe it was my mom, so I started walking down the stairs, and the rustling of the bag stopped. I turned down the couch side lamp, and there I was, greeted with a massive man, both in height and size, wearing a red suit and hat and a familiar long white beard. It was Santa Claus. He waved me over, and I nervously but excitedly walked over to him. He patted my head and said he was just delivering my presents from his black bag. I looked at the bag, which seemed to be full of small boxes. I tried to get a peek in the bag, but he stopped me and said, No, don't do that. It's a surprise." I noticed there were already some presents under the tree. He turned me around and whispered in my ear I need to go back to bed. For some reason I didn't go. I just turned around and kept looking at Santa. Eventually, he actually started walking me up the stairs, telling me we need to be quiet. He asked me which way my room was, and then he told me to go up the second flight of stairs. That was when I actually obeyed him. I looked down the stairs when I was at the top, and all I saw was the eerie figure of the Santa Claus looking up at me. I realized he turned off the nightlight as I was walking up the stairs. I went to my room and shut the door, excited that I just saw Santa. As I tried to fall back asleep, I heard a loud bang from downstairs in the den. The sound traveled all the way back up to my room. I assumed that was Santa leaving the house. The next morning, I woke up early to my mom's screams downstairs. I ran down to the den, where my mom and dad already were, to a disturbing and confusing scene for my young self. There were no presents under the tree, and the sliding window was broken. I don't mean the glass was shattered, I mean it was slammed shut so hard it got knocked off the sliding mechanism. I confusedly asked my parents what happened, and explained that I saw Santa last night. When I told them this, they frantically tried getting as much info out of me as possible. My dad called the police, and when I asked him about the story for fresh details before writing this, he said the 911 operator said on the line that 2 other calls for the same incident had come in that morning. Apparently a man dressed as Santa Claus was targeting certain houses with accessible windows, and he was stealing the gifts under their Christmas trees. I believe there's a special place in hell for that man. My parents had to tell me later that day that Santa isn't real, and that should anything like that ever happen again, not to trust it. I once worked as a night security guard for a brief, horrible part of my life. It was for many places, but for the longest time, a mall in Chicago, which I'll leave the name out so that the story can in no way get traced back to me. As the lone night security guard in a huge city mall, it was very relaxing and laid back. But of course, working graveyard hours was the worst, especially when I had to do it on Christmas Eve night. I did my regular pacing back and forth the wide halls of the mall, occasionally having a seat by the big center Christmas tree which would stay lit 24/7. After getting a coffee from the security lounge section, I stepped back into the hall and noticed all the way on the other side of the mall, a light was on in one of the stores. A light that wasn't on before, I swear it. No one was supposed to be in the mall besides me. I jogged over to the store and set my coffee down under a plant. It was a jewelry shop. I tried opening the door, but it was locked. So how could anyone be in there? The light in the store suddenly started flickering, so naturally I had to chalk it up as faulty wiring, false alarm. I knelt down to pick up my coffee again, and as I looked up, I saw someone's head behind the front counter of the store. Just their head, like they were hiding. But it happened so fast. One moment there was light, the next darkness, and when the light flicked back on again, the head was gone. I literally rubbed my eyes and shook my head, wondering was I seeing things. I took my master keyring off my belt and fiddled for the key to the store. I didn't know where the light switch was, and to be honest, I was way too freaked out to check behind that counter with nothing but a flashlight. I shut the door and relocked it and walked back to my post by the Christmas tree. I started chugging my coffee because I really thought I was losing it after seeing what I saw. The lights in that store all the ways down on the other side of the hall were still off, but I heard a click and then a bang echo down in my direction, followed by someone running across one side of the hall to the other, before disappearing in an intersecting exit hallway. I sprang up and almost spit out the remainder of my coffee. I ran down the hall till I came to the intersecting smaller hallway. This hallway, which led to one of the exits, had a bunch of massage chairs, coin-operated kiddie rides, and the public restrooms. I didn't see anywhere else that person could have gone besides the restroom, as the exit doors were all locked from both sides. I got to the door of the men's bathroom and stopped, once again faced with the fear of confronting whoever was in that mall with me. I cracked the door open just slightly, enough for me to start speaking into the bathroom, saying whoever's in here needs to get out before I call the cops. There was a crying and moaning type noise coming from inside the restroom. I opened the door fully and realized it was coming from one of the stalls. I repeated what I said at the door, but the crying sounds didn't stop. I knelt down in front of the stall to get a peek under, and I saw two black shoes facing the door, facing me. It seemed the person was just facing the stall door, making these crying noises. The crying stopped, and then the next thing I saw was the person on the other side of the stall quickly get on their knees and look under the door back at me. I recognized it as the same person from behind that counter in that store. I got back on my feet and left the bathroom to call the police and explain the situation. As a security guard, I never encountered anything like this overnight, and I did know how to deal with it. I definitely did not want to make it physical. A couple police officers came to the doors at the end of the hall, and I let them in. We all went to the men's bathroom again, and the stall door was still shut, and the man was still inside. For the longest time, the officers demanded he come out with his hands up. After a while of him refusing to listen, the male officer started kicking in the stall door until it broke open. The two officers apprehended the nut job inside the stall. As they walked him out of the mall, though, the man had his head turned to look at me the entire time. I looked away. His dead eyes staring into my soul genuinely disturbed me. He looked like he wanted to kill me. Before he was put in the back of the police car, he said my name, and I immediately got the chills. The officers said they would find out who he is and everything, and they went on their way. My shift ended a few hours later, and for the remainder of my time working at that mall, I was always paranoid every time I'd turn a corner that he'd be standing there.
Our parents had our youngest sibling much later than they had my brother and I. This happened last year when I was 18, my older brother was 24, and our youngest sibling Rachel was just 2. I was home from college for winter break. My older brother would be returning home from out of state in a few days, and my parents were on a couple's vacation. It was about a week before Christmas, and I was tasked with taking care of Rachel until my parents got back. My time watching Rachel consisted of a lot of sitting around the house, having friends over, and just watching TV and movies. I would let Rachel play in the living room with her toys as I'd watch TV with no lights on but the Christmas tree, which I always find to make watching TV a lot more relaxing. When Rachel started to get tired, I brought her up to her room, changed her, and put her in the crib upstairs. I made sure to turn on the baby monitor as my parents did every night just to make sure I could hear her if she got restless. Something to note, Rachel's room shares a bathroom with my mom and dad's room. So basically, both my parents' and Rachel's rooms are connected to a bathroom, which thus connects the 2 bedrooms in a sense. I went back downstairs to watch TV. I think I was watching The Grinch when sounds started coming from the baby monitor. Distorted, human-like noises. It didn't sound like Rachel, so I hurried back upstairs to Rachel's room. I burst in so quickly and aggressively that she immediately awoke and started crying. I looked around the room naturally. Then I picked Rachel up and started gently rocking her. But I realized this didn't help. She was probably too big for it. So I put her back down in the crib and started tickling her, then gently whispering her back to sleep. When she had her eyes closed again, I left the room. A few minutes later, I heard Rachel crying again through the baby monitor. I ran up to see what's wrong, and she was standing in her crib, pointing at the bathroom door, which was cracked open. I honestly didn't remember if it had been cracked open like that earlier or not. I went to check the bathroom, and it was clear. I told her calmly she's imagining things. I wasn't sure how much she understood of what I was saying, but after a few minutes in there with her, I got her to settle back down. Once again, I went down to the living room to continue watching TV. The orange light on the baby monitor once again started going off. I felt like I was in a horror movie scenario. I could distinctly hear a man's whispering coming from the baby monitor. I ran back up to that room faster than ever, burst through the door to Rachel's crying again. I went to pick her up to get her out of there. And when I turned for the door, I looked into the dark bathroom, which now had the door wide open. There was a man in my parents' room, and he started walking through the bathroom towards me and Rachel. I ran out of the house to the neighbor's house while holding Rachel. Our neighbor Judy let us in and let me use her phone to call the cops. They didn't find anyone, but Judy let us stay the night at her place regardless. The next morning, Judy went back to my house with me to look around as support. The house seemed clear. However, I couldn't help but look around the house to try and find out how he got in. But I just couldn't, and it made no sense. A couple weeks later, my mom sent me to the attic to put some of the Christmas decorations away, and you wouldn't believe what I found up there. In the corner of the attic was a bed of blankets and a pillow, hidden behind a bunch of ripped up boxes stacked up as a wall. I immediately associated it to that man in our house. We have no idea how long that man was actually in our house for. My immediate family always hosted Christmas when I was younger. At the time, we lived on the upper level of a 2-family house. My parents owned the house and rented the bottom floor out to multiple tenants throughout the years. Christmas time of 2012, a new tenant had just moved in downstairs. He was a quiet-seeming 30-something-year-old male, and quiet was the kind of tenant my parents were looking for. Unfortunately, a few days into him moving in downstairs, there would be a lot of noises at off hours of the night. Like, for example, the front door would open and shut numerous times throughout the night, and sometimes there would be loud talking, in some instances yelling. My dad went downstairs one night to see what the commotion was,
and to ask him to keep the noise down. That was the start of my dad's suspicions about that guy downstairs. Fast forward to Christmas Eve night. We had the whole family over, dining room table stretched out with all 20 seats taken. My Uncle Jake is a heavy smoker, so he goes outside to smoke several times throughout the night. After our main course, Uncle Jake went outside for yet another smoke. He mistakenly left his phone on the table, however, and when it rang a few times after he went outside, my dad ordered me to go run his phone to him outside. So I grabbed his flip phone and ran it down the stairs. However, before I went out the front door, I stopped and noticed the back door was open. See, when you walk into the house, there's a little hallway with 3 doors. One door which led to the downstairs apartment, the front door, and then a hallway that stretched to the back door. The back door was open, so I figured my uncle went out back. The phone was still ringing, so I hurried to the backyard to find my uncle, but he didn't seem to be back there. Just when I was about to give up, I heard someone in the shed, and the shed door was open. I called for my uncle, and someone came out of the shed. It was too dark to see him, but I was pretty sure it was my uncle. He started walking over to me fast. At first I assumed because he wanted to answer his phone in time, but when he got close enough to the lights from inside of the house, I could see his face. It wasn't my uncle, but rather the tenant from downstairs. For some reason, the way he was approaching me I found intimidating, so I turned and ran for the door. I slammed it in that man's face and went to the front yard, where I found my Uncle Jake smoking. I stood by him and told him about the downstairs tenant, and how he seemingly just charged at me. My uncle is the kind of guy to not really take things I say seriously, or he's just not that kind of person to confront someone. I stayed with him until he finished his smoke because I was uncomfortable. Then we walked back upstairs to the dinner table together, where I told my dad about the tenant in the shed and how he followed me. There was a silence at the table, and my dad seemed a little concerned, but I guess he didn't want to ruin the remainder of our Christmas dinner, so he waited until we were done to check outside. When he came back up, he said the neighbor wouldn't answer his door, but that the shed outside was shut. A couple hours later, the last of our family left, and my immediate family started getting ready for bed. I stayed up in the living room by the fire and tree because I liked the lighting the two gave off. I watched a Christmas movie, and I guess I nodded off at some point while watching it. However, I do remember waking up suddenly from a kind of half-sleep and hearing a creaking on the stairs. I was too tired to move from my laying position, plus I assumed it was just my mom, dad, or sister. Not to mention our giant Christmas tree blocked my view of the stairs. We had all carpeted floors upstairs, so I couldn't hear whoever it was roaming around. But I heard a door down the hall open, probably my sister going back to bed. By now the fire seemed to be almost dead, and the movie I was watching was over. The clock under the TV read 1 in the morning. I figured I'd just stay on the couch at that point because I was so comfortable. A few minutes later, I heard something rustling by the tree. It sounded like an ornament fell off of it. Someone had definitely walked into it. I flipped on my side and looked at the tree, but it was as still as it always was though. I flipped back on my other side, eyes still open, and saw a man standing over me, bending slightly. Of course, initially my first reaction was to scream. My second reaction was to analyze the face to see if it was my father, and when I realized it wasn't my father, rather the downstairs tenant, I screamed even louder. The man tried to cover my mouth, but at that point I think he realized it was too late. Everyone heard me. He ran for the stairs just as my dad stormed out of his room. My dad chased after him, but he was already driving down the street. I think when he was standing over me, he was making sure I was asleep before robbing the place or something. Fortunately for us, my parents had copies of his ID and other important information, which my parents used to find him and sue him for breaking and entering, and we won the case in a landslide. Don't let that take away from the fact that it was still an insanely scary thing to go through. It was Christmas Eve of 2015. I had recently gotten a new job as a psychiatric nurse, but I had to start with the overnight shifts, and that included Christmas Eve night, which was a Thursday. Well, technically it was a Friday by the time I arrived to work. But anyway, most of my shifts are slow and boring, with a lot of sitting around a computer for most of the night, since most of the patients are asleep during the hours that I was there. Occasionally I'd have to check on patients and observe their behavior, or deal with patients who would become restless in the middle of the night. Dealing with so many people with mental disabilities at once was a lot to take in at first, but the Christmas decorations scattered throughout the building brought a little extra cheer to the place. At night, the main lights in the hallways go out and a dim set of lights turn on. These dim lights mixed with the Christmas lights that had been hung up all over the place created a more relaxed, comfortable setting. There was one particular patient who had been creeping me out. Her name was Abatha. She was an old, sickly lady with severe schizophrenia. She oftentimes would mumble to herself incomprehensible things, and sometimes she'd say things out loud that I'd assume were directed at me, but she'd just be talking to herself. It was about 3 in the morning when I went to go check on Abatha, who had been awake the whole night. I came in and asked if she needed anything, and she just looked at me with a horrific smile and laughed. It gave me chills because I felt like I was witnessing something from a scary movie. She looked away from me and started muttering something. I didn't understand most of it, but the words that did pop out to me were, "Check the bathroom." I asked her to repeat herself, but she didn't acknowledge me. She just turned to her side and rested her head on the pillow. I tried to get her to confirm she wanted me to check the bathroom, but she wouldn't answer now. So I checked the bathroom across from her bed in her room, but as I expected, there was nothing out of the ordinary. I left her room and went back to my desk in the hall. Then I looked at the bathroom door across from my desk. My curiosity got the better of me, so I went into the bathroom, but the lights wouldn't turn on. I stood by the doorway listening for a moment, and I heard breathing and then a click sound from one of the stalls. I went to get the door stopper from behind the desk and wedged it under the bathroom door so that the light from the hall would let me see at least a little bit into the bathroom. I got on my knees and checked under the stalls from a distance. No feet could be seen in either of the stalls, though. One stall of the 2 had its door shut, though. I went up to it and stuck my eye through the crack of the door. It was really dark, but I felt like I could see something at the back of the stall. I got back down on my knees to look under the door, but when I did, I couldn't see what I thought I just saw. I got back up and took one more look through the crack of the door, and there was someone's face right on the other side, peeking through the crack just as I was. I almost fell to the floor in fright, but managed to run to the door and slam it shut. I grabbed the key from the desk and locked the bathroom door. I told another nurse that there was someone in the bathroom, but when we checked together, not only did the lights now work, but the stalls were both open and no one was inside either of them. It was impossible for someone to have left the room. I locked the door. That night, before my shift ended, I tried to question Abatha about what was in the bathroom, but she wouldn't answer me. Just as I gave up and walked to the door with my jacket on, I heard her say, "Merry Christmas." I turned and saw her giving me a smile. Only the smile didn't give me a good feeling. There was something unsettling about it. I had to turn and leave. I had to work with Abatha for a few more weeks before she was transferred to another center for hospice care. To this day, I still feel there was a connection between Abatha and whatever I saw in that bathroom. It's literally just one of those stories I just can't even try to understand or rationalize, but it still haunts me. Last year for Christmas, I wanted to do something new with my girlfriend. We just got a new apartment together last year and still live in it to this day. It was our first Christmas in the apartment, however, and neither of us had ever cut down our own tree. So I came up with the idea to go cut down our own tree. Luckily, we live in New Hampshire, so spruce trees happen to grow in our state. My girlfriend Tristan and I took a short road trip on a snowy evening to a forest full of spruce trees. I chose to go while it was snowing because I felt it made the whole experience more Christmassy. I pulled my pickup truck up into what appeared to be a small opening on the side of the road. It was hard to tell given that there was snow on the ground. I heard gravel crunching under the tires as I pulled off the road. It was a perfect place to leave the truck while Tristan and I went to find a tree. We were in a very hilly part of the state, so we had to do a lot of uphill walking. Unfortunately, my girlfriend was complaining a lot. She didn't seem to find our little field trip to be as fun of an idea as I did. We pressed on uphill through the snow, searching for a small enough spruce tree that could fit in our living room. Most of the trees we were finding were too big. Eventually we found that perfect one though, just the right size. I gave the tree one good pat and shake before I lifted the axe I was carrying into the air and began chopping away at the trunk. The trunk was relatively skinny, so after a bunch of good hits, the tree toppled over with one good kick. Of course I wouldn't be carrying it alone, and I'd prefer not to drag it all the way down the hill through the snow, so I asked Tristan to grab the top end while I grabbed the trunk. Then she suddenly complained that she didn't have gloves. There was an extra pair in the car. I didn't realize she didn't bring them though. I threw her the keys and told her to hurry back to the trunk and get the gloves. She ran off back down the hill, and I was left alone standing in the middle of the woods next to the freshly cut tree. Tristan was taking a while, so I sat down on the trunk of the tree and observed my surroundings. Pine trees as far as the eyes can see, which wasn't too far anymore considering it was just about dark now. I turned on the flashlight I brought with me to make it easier for Tristan to find me again. Other than the sound of the wind and tiny snowflakes hitting the ground, it was completely silent. It was actually a little creepy sitting out there all alone. Finally, I heard the sound of boots walking in the snow nearby. I called out in a loud yell Tristan's name and waved my flashlight in that direction. The footsteps stopped, however, and there wasn't a response. I thought she must have been trying to sneak up on me, so I figured I'd turn the tables on her. I placed the flashlight on the stump, aimed it out into the woods, and did the best I could to quietly go hide behind a tree to wait for her to come out. I knelt down behind a big pine tree and heard the footsteps coming closer. Finally, someone came running into the light of the flashlight, and I mean like full-on charging out. But it wasn't my girlfriend. It was some random guy in a coat with a hood covering his head. He stopped and looked down at the flashlight, grabbed it, then turned it off. And now that it was dark again, I could barely see him. Based on the way he charged up to the flashlight like that, I couldn't imagine he meant well. I took one big breath before I started sprinting down the hill back to the car. It made so much noise that I knew he had to have heard it, but I didn't want to turn around and look. When I got about halfway down the hill, I started hearing screams. They were the screams of Tristan shouting out my name in what sounded like a panic. When I got to the bottom of the hill, I started to hear the truck's horn honking. I made it to the truck and jumped into the driver's seat. Tristan was sitting in the car waiting. She screamed at me to drive, but I didn't need to hear it from her to know to do that. As I drove the truck out of that little clearing, we both looked back and saw a man standing where my truck was not even 5 seconds ago, watching us drive away. It was a long drive home, but by the time we got back to our town, we stopped at a Home Depot and picked up a tree there. Never again will we attempt to cut down our own tree.
It was a cold December night a week before Christmas. My family always does Christmas in our Hamptons, New York summer house. The Hamptons are always quiet this time of year, as a large chunk of the real estate there is owned by rich people who have 2 or 3 other houses elsewhere in the country. My dad and I were at the house first before the rest of my family, as my mom and sister still had work until the next weekend. My dad was retired at the time, and school was over for winter break for me, so we wanted to just go to the Hamptons house early. We all have our own bedrooms in this house, which sits on a quiet dead-end road. My dad turned on the heat and water and all that stuff that he always has to take care of when we return for the first time in months. I brought my PS3 to play in my room. I spent most of the first day there playing video games. On that first night we were there was a big snowstorm, another reason we wanted to come early, to beat the crappy road conditions that would come for days after the storm. The next morning when I woke up and went out to the kitchen, my dad asked me when I built the snowman. I responded, "What do you mean?" He said the snowman in the backyard. I went to look out the window, and there was at least 2 feet of fresh snow. But there was also a snowman sitting in our backyard. It had 2 sticks for arms angled up into the air, and it had eyes and a smile carved into the head. The eyes and mouth side was facing the window. I said to my dad I didn't build that. My dad laughed and said, "Must be the neighbor kids." My dad thought it was an innocent joke, so I did as well. The next night is where things got bad though. I was in bed asleep and suddenly woke up to a distinct thump on my window. I was terrified. I pulled the blankets over myself to hide, to not be in view of whoever might be out there. But after 5 minutes, I started to wonder maybe it was snow that fell off the roof and blew into the window. I got up to peek out the window. I screamed because at first I thought what I saw was a person, but it was actually another snowman standing right outside my window. There was an angry frown on this one instead of a smiling face. I screamed for my dad and he came rushing inside. I pointed at the window, and this time he wasn't happy. He said he would go next door in the morning and talk to the kids' parents. I slept in my sister's room the rest of that night. The next morning, my dad went next door and rang the bell, but they weren't home. There were no cars in the driveway. That meant they weren't even in town. That was the only nearby house with kids in it, so this didn't exactly help explain the situation. For 5 or 6 days straight, nothing else happened until Christmas Eve night. The rest of our immediate family, plus all 4 of our grandparents, were now in the house. We were in the living room. This was before dinner, but it was already dark out. Someone knocked on the front door instead of using the doorbell. We weren't expecting any other family. I started to get nervous. My dad went over and asked, "Who is it?" Someone on the other side of the door started saying, "Please let me in, I need help." The door has no peephole or windows, nor are there any windows that would allow us to see who was on the other side of the door. My dad asked what's wrong, and the voice on the other side said, "I have no one to spend Christmas with, please help me." We all looked at each other now, and my dad yelled to please leave before we call the police. The person on the other side said, "Okay, I'll leave, please don't call the police." He never opened the door. We instantly tied this to the creepy snowmen. We knew it had to be connected. And we were right. On Christmas morning, there was a note taped to our front door. It said, "To the best of my memory, I just wanted to have a little fun. I built the snowmen for the boy in the house. I don't have anyone to spend the holiday with. Hurt." In one way or another, I think whoever left that note on our door and built those 2 snowmen was mentally ill or unstable. It's very unlikely that it was meant to be a joke, considering he came to our front door. I think he was dangerous, and even if he wasn't inherently hostile, the fact that he did what he did is just enough for him to be considered somebody none of us wanted to meet. It was Christmas of 2016. My name is Andre, and at the time I was 21 years old. Our family was all at our Uncle Joshua's place for the holidays. Well, it was Christmas Eve. My immediate family, plus my cousins and other close family, decided let's go to my uncle and aunt's place in downtown Miami. We come from Connecticut, so we're not used to warm weather around the holidays. It was Friday, the day before Christmas Eve. My brother Nico and I, being young single males and being in Miami, wanted to go out. We were hearing about a bunch of Christmas-themed parties going on at clubs and bars. Nico was 18 at the time, but he had a fake ID, so we figured he'd be alright. We went to this one club on Miami Beach that was having a Christmas-themed event. Mostly everyone online was wearing Santa hats, so it felt festive. But it was all a waste of time because at the front of the line, the bouncer not only told us it would be $100 to get in, but he also called Nico out on his fake ID. So we tried a bar not too far away, and we got into this one. There were some people wearing Santa hats here too. I guess that was expected on the weekend of Christmas. While we were at the bar, this older woman started talking to Nico. I overheard most of their conversation. The woman appeared to be mid-40s, and I heard her keep telling my brother how she has such a thing for younger guys with Hispanic accents. To be honest, it sounded kinda creepy and weird, but Nico was probably blinded by the fact that a woman was hitting on him. I just let him do his thing. The woman was wearing a blue Santa hat and had on a sexually provocative Christmas sweater. The 2 of them were talking for so long that I ended up making friends with the guy sitting next to me at the bar. Then suddenly Nico patted me on my shoulder and said he's gonna leave with the woman. I told him all right. I was happy for him, I guess. I stayed at the bar not much longer after that. Then I just called an Uber back to my uncle's, assuming Nico would be spending the night with the woman. I was mid-Uber ride when my phone rang. Nico was calling me. I picked up to static. It sounded as though maybe he pocket dialed me, but I heard a male's voice in the background that didn't sound like my brother. And then suddenly another male's voice could be heard yelling. I said Nico's name over and over trying for acknowledgement, but the call eventually disconnected. Obviously this was a pretty concerning phone call. I was under the impression he was alone with a woman. I tried calling him like 10 times, and finally someone picked up. But it wasn't Nico. It was the voice of some older man with an extremely deep voice. When I asked who this was, he said he found this phone on the sidewalk. I asked him if he could drop the phone off at my uncle's place or if he could meet me somewhere. He didn't answer that. I just heard talking in the background, and then I heard screaming. It was Nico's voice in the background, screaming my name, screaming help. Then the call disconnected. I asked the Uber driver to pull over, as I was freaking out trying to call anyone in my family. It was late, no one was picking up. I explained the situation to the driver, and he advised I call the police immediately. That's what I did. The police came to my uncle's place, where I woke my family up, informing them that Nico was in trouble. I had to give my best description of the woman's appearance from the bar and what time he left the bar. Then, my dad and I, along with the police, went to the bar that we were at, and it was then that I got a phone call from a random number. It was Nico. He was out of breath, gasping into the phone, explaining that he was kidnapped and barely escaped. He was currently using a stranger's phone. All of us went to Nico's location, which was a sketchy street somewhere in North Miami. When we found him, his face was a bloody mess, he had 2 black eyes, and all of his possessions that he had on him were stolen. He gave his whole story. He left with the woman who claimed to have called an Uber or Lyft. When the alleged ride arrived at their pickup point, which was in some quiet back alley area, Nico found out once inside the car that it wasn't in fact an Uber. It was a trap. There were 2 men in the car who immediately held him down and threatened to shoot him if he didn't keep quiet. They started to drive for a while, and during this time, one of the men called my number and they threatened to harm him if he yelled out anything, which he did, and that explained the bloody face and black eyes. They broke his phone, took his wallet, keys, and whatever else was on him. As the car was stopped and he wasn't being held down anymore, he ran for it out of the car. They didn't chase him, the car just sped off and disappeared. He said he believed they were going to kill him and dump his body somewhere if he didn't run. Police apparently were never able to identify the woman who appeared in the video footage from the bar. Nico said none of the men were wearing masks, more of a reason he thought they'd kill him. This completely ruined the entire holiday weekend, but we were all just happy he was alive. On Christmas night, we were all awoken to Nico's screams in the middle of the night. He was screaming, "She's in the house." I woke him up from whatever nightmare he was having. I have to say though, him screaming, "She's in the house," made me think back to her creepy smile, and made me sleep with one eye open that night. I bought a small house with my brother George a couple years back. We hosted Christmas the first year we lived in the house just as a way of getting the family to see the place and getting everyone together for the first time in forever. We don't have the biggest family in the world, so it was the 2 of us, our parents, our aunt and uncle, cousin, and our sister and 2 nephews. Our sister came with our nephews and her husband first to help us out with the cooking and preparing. They brought their dog Mika along as well. Since they lived 2 hours away, they were going to be spending the night at our house. The rest of our family lives under an hour away, so they wouldn't be staying. Not that that house would have much more room for additional people staying over anyway. During our Christmas dinner, at one point we talked about some of the murders that happened in our area recently. Bodies had been found in the woods in our county. It wasn't a topic that we kept going long, as our mom and my sister wanted us to drop it for the sake of the holiday and the kids. After dinner, we all had some wine in the living room with a Christmas movie on in the background as we talked. After a few hours, the family started to slowly leave, until it was just my brother and I, and my sister, her husband, and her kids. The kids went to bed before us. The 4 of us stayed up later having more wine. My girlfriend ended up coming over past 10 to spend the rest of the night with me, since all of her family had gone home. Eventually, Christmas night was over, and it was time to go to bed. I woke up to my girlfriend shaking me. The room was still dark. I groggily looked at the clock next to my bed, and it said 2-something a.m. I asked my girlfriend what the issue was, and she whispered, "Listen." I listened, and heard Mika out in the hall growling. I got out of bed and entered the hall to see what was going on. Then I saw that the back door to our house was wide open, and a breeze of cold air started to hit me in the face. Mika was looking out the door. I checked if anyone was out there, and as I was at the back door, I heard my brother's voice call out my name from the darkness outside. He sounded like he was far away in the woods. I was worried he was in trouble or needed help with something. I went back to my room to tell my girlfriend, as I put my shoes and coat on. I stepped outside with a flashlight. There was a light dusting of snow on the ground, enough to see footmarks leading from the back door down to the back deck towards the woods. I yelled back George's name very loudly. I heard his voice call back my name. It was confirmed he was in the woods now. But oddly, as I entered the woods, his footprints slowly faded and got harder to see, until they were just impossible to continue following entirely. I screamed back at the top of my lungs, "Where are you? What's wrong?" I once again heard George's voice call back just my name. Every time he called me, his voice was the same distance away. I was uncomfortable getting any further away from my house because I didn't want to get lost in the woods. I tried finally calling George's phone, but he didn't pick up. I continued a little further into the woods, but now George's yelling stopped. As much as I yelled out into the woods, there was dead silence. Not even the sound of a bug in the freezing cold. Just the sound of the light breeze. And suddenly my phone rang. I was hopeful it was George, but it was my girlfriend. I picked up, and she said, "Chet, George is in his bedroom right now." "What?" I said. That didn't make any sense. I was hearing his voice this entire time in the woods. I asked her to check if my sister's husband was also still on one of the pull-out couches, and 30 seconds later, she said yes. Suddenly, I felt like I wasn't alone in the woods, like anyone was about to grab me from any direction. I turned back the way I came and started running as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I saw the backyard light from my house becoming more visible through the trees. I made it back to my house, and everyone was awake now. George and everyone else had a look of horror on their faces when I explained that Mika was growling, looking at the wide open back door, and the fact that there were footprints leading into the woods. But the scariest part was that I thought for sure that the voice I was hearing was that of George, and whoever it was knew my name. We contemplated calling the police for half an hour, and then ended up doing so. A police officer came and just asked us any questions like if anything was stolen, if we know anyone that may mean us harm, etc. Then within half an hour, and after telling us to call back if anything else happens, he left. I don't know if I think this had anything to do with the murders that were going on at this time in our county, but I did think it was worth mentioning in the story. Nothing else did ever happen after that night, but we can't for the life of us logically explain any of this. I'm still scared to go in or near the woods past dark. Meeting my ex-girlfriend's family during the holidays was the worst weekend of my life. They lived in a different state than my ex Kaylee and I. We were on Long Island in New York. They were all the way up in Vermont. Our relationship was still kind of new, but she seemed to think it was serious enough for her parents to invite the two of us up there for Christmas. Kaylee had a really small family, so apparently it would be just the two of us, her brother, and her parents. Pulling up to the house was a pleasant surprise. The house was beautiful, and it stood on a huge, well-kept property secluded from any other houses. As Kaylee and I got out of my truck, her parents came out to the porch to greet us. First impressions, they seemed friendly and weird. An unexplainable type of friendly. The father didn't smile, but he shook my hand, patted me on the back, and said it was great to meet me. The mother hugged me, showing a lot more emotion, but something about her face was a bit off-putting. She had a really wide smile that seemed a bit exaggerated. The house was as beautiful inside as it was outside. It had a wooden lodge-type atmosphere to it. A little while later, I met Katie's brother Paul, who got home from work. He was a really socially awkward dude. He had a bowl cut and had a whole tattoo sleeve running up his arm. We had dinner, which was awkward at certain moments, but other than that, it was kind of normal. After dinner, we watched a Christmas movie in the living room. I tried not to make eye contact,
but I could tell Paul kept looking at me for extended periods of time, on a few different occasions. At one point, I finally looked back at him, and we locked eyes for like 3 seconds before he turned back to the TV. He was giving me the most judgmental stare I'd ever seen, and it made me only more uncomfortable. At the end of the night, Kaylee and I were in the guest room, which had an attached bathroom. Kaylee was in the bathroom. She left her phone on the nightstand. I saw she got a text from her mom, and for some reason, feeling a bit snoopy, I got up to read it. It was not at all what I was expecting, and it changed the whole night completely. Briefly on the screen, it said, "Text from mom. Do you think he suspects anything yet?" But the message quickly switched to new message, I'm guessing because she had iMessage notifications set to hide once the phone locks. I wanted to read what was said before that, but her phone had a password, unfortunately. I could actually feel my heart pumping now. Kaylee came back into the room. I kind of gave her the cold shoulder because my mind was racing. She seemed to notice. She was texting on her phone for a bit before turning out the lamp and going to sleep. I couldn't sleep though. I was rolling around for hours wondering what that text meant, and if it was about me. And what the hell was up with her brother? It was exactly 2 in the morning when I heard Kaylee get out of bed, but she was doing so very quietly. Normally I'd find this to be a kind gesture, but under the circumstances, I was finding this suspicious now. I didn't move. I pretended to still be asleep. I heard her come to my side of the bed and stand there for a few moments, then leaving the room and walking downstairs. Then I heard someone else walking downstairs, and then another person. Something was going on. I went over to the top of the stairs to listen to what was going on downstairs. There was a bunch of talking, but in very low voices. I walked down a few stairs quietly. The talking was coming from the dining room by the stairs. It sounded like they were planning something. I heard Kaylee say something like, "When I go back up, you stand by the door." Then I heard her brother say something, but what was going on was really starting to hit me in the face, or at least what I think was going on. I went back to the room to grab my stuff and leave. As I was grabbing the keys, I noticed something in the corner of the room. I turned the lamp on, which exposed Kaylee's dad sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, blank expression on his face behind his glasses, staring at me. I screamed at least 4 times, "You're all crazy," as I ran to my car. I put the car in drive practically before the car was even fully on and floored it out of that long driveway back to the road. I didn't stop once except for gas. And at that gas stop, I checked my phone and saw Kaylee texted me saying, "What the fuck happened?" I didn't respond. Not until later that night when I got home. I said, "I don't know what you and your sick family were planning on doing to me. I don't want to know. Don't ever contact me or come near me again, and I won't report this." I said this only because I knew there was no proof at all of what happened, or what might have been about to happen. She never replied. It was Christmas Eve night, 1 in the morning. I was in our den watching TV because I always like to stay up extra late on Christmas Eve. To make things more festive and cozy feeling, it was during a snowstorm. I left the window open and the backyard light on just so I could also have the view of the snow in the backyard. I was focused on the TV at the moment, but through my peripheral vision, I thought I could briefly see something in the backyard. I turned to the window, but besides the falling snow, there was nothing going on out there. Still, I got up and went to the window just to be sure. Nothing. I sat back down on the couch, but now I was constantly checking the window to see if anything was outside. About 10 minutes later, I calmed down and forgot about it and reverted my full attention back to the movie. Then I heard, loud and clear, the backyard gate slam shut.
Now I almost knew someone was back there. I slipped on my shoes and a jacket and went out to the backyard to check it out. There were boot marks in the snow leading from one gate across the yard to the other gate. I was not feeling brave enough to follow them, so I went back inside. As I was taking off my boots and jacket, I saw a track of wet, muddy snow on the den carpet, leading from the office to the hallway that led to the living room. That was also the way to my parents' room. First, I had to go to the office to see how they broke in, so I followed the boot marks to the office without turning on any lights to make my presence known. I was expecting to see one of the windows busted open, but everything was intact. Then I realized the boot marks didn't start in this room. They ended in this room. I slowly lifted my head up to the garage door in the corner of the room. It was open, and right under the doorway there was someone in a winter coat, jeans, and boots, squatting down as if trying to hide, back facing me, but his head turned to look at me. I stood there with my mouth open in horror for a few seconds before I ran for it to my parents' room, screaming the whole way there. I got my dad to come out as quickly as possible, and on our way to the garage together, we heard the actual garage door opening. By the time we got there, the intruder was gone. Realistically, we could have followed his boot marks, but who knows how far he'd gotten by that point. We found out he broke in through an unlocked living room window. Just goes to show, if somebody has intentions of breaking into your house, they'll find a way, which is why you should always lock all your doors and windows. I'm the oldest of 4, and during the events of this story, I was 16, my younger sister was 11, and my 2 younger brothers were 8 and 7. My parents and their group of friends were a part of a club that was basically for rich, snobby people. The club always hosted a Christmas party one night in December each year at a big fancy firehouse. Of course, for all the younger kids, like my siblings, somebody would always dress up as Santa Claus and hand out the presents that were left in a sack by a chair, which had a red blanket over it. This year, my dad's best friend Michael was dressing up as Santa. He was sitting at the same table as us, so when the time came for him to leave and get changed into the Santa suit, I saw him get up and walk out the door. There were like 20 young kids there, they never noticed. Everyone was having a good time, chatting and whatnot, kids playing on the floor in the center of the room, when the door to the firehouse opened and bells were heard jingling. All the kids jumped up yelling Santa, and in came Michael in a surprisingly unimpressive Santa costume. It honestly looked like the cheapest thing he could find at Party City. A serious downgrade from last year. The hat and the beard were alright, but the costume just seemed cheap. Not the usual costume the club supplied. He chuckled and did his best Santa impression. I had to say, he was doing a really good job of changing his voice though. I saw a few of my parents' friends whispering to each other. Michael grabbed the bag of gifts and said in his best Santa voice he'd be right back with the presents. He sounded so different though. He walked out the door with the bag of gifts. That's when my dad and a couple other guys ran after him yelling, "Hey." I still didn't know what was going on. Not until my mom told me that wasn't Michael. I wanted to feel important, I guess, so I ran outside to the parking lot as well, where I found my dad and 2 other guys standing there, looking around dumbfounded. The man dressed as Santa was gone. The real thing they were concerned about was where Michael was. Michael's car was also missing. I asked them if they were sure that wasn't Michael. They were all positive though. We tried calling Michael, but his phone was off. We tried his house phone after a while too, which went to voicemail. We had to send a search party, but we couldn't find him anywhere though. Eventually my dad and I returned to the firehouse to pick up my mom and siblings. Just about everyone went home by then. I waited outside. I heard a scream for help in the distance. It came from the woods, deep in the woods.
I ran to the tree line to scream back Michael's name. He yelled back help again. It was him. I was too excited to go back for my dad, so I ran into the woods following his screams for help, and I found him, tied to a tree in a bloody mess. Blood was dripping from his forehead down to his face. He looked like he'd been beaten by a blunt object. I cut the little rope with my key, and he struggled to his feet. I walked him back to the parking lot, and he screamed when he saw his car was gone. When Michael left the building planning to get changed into the Santa costume, he was jumped by 3 guys wearing masks, one of whom struck him in the forehead with something metal repeatedly until he was knocked out. Next thing he knew, he woke up tied to a tree in the woods. It's sick to think that 3 or 4 men could have set up a plan like this, involving harming somebody just to steal a bunch of gifts from children, some of them pretty expensive. And to add insult to injury, they stole Michael's $50,000 car. I felt terrible for him, and I still do. It's not the kind of story that he can just bring up for fun. It's still a painful story to tell, even for me.
Last year on Christmas Eve, I was working late. I'm 23, I work in New York City and commute home every day on the train. Since I'm one of the younger ones in the office, I got stuck with one of the worst shifts, so I wasn't able to get home until 5 o'clock. My family had already left a whole hour earlier to go to my cousin's house, so I had to drive alone. After having a quick snack before the half-hour drive, I got back in my car and put my cousin's address into my phone. Halfway through the drive, it started snowing. I got to my cousin's house around 6 o'clock. It was snowing heavily by this point, and I just made it in time to catch everyone starting dinner. I brought all of my gifts inside and cheerfully said hey to everyone. I stayed until around 11 o'clock. The rest of my family left a little sooner. I stayed an extra half hour or so just to hang out before leaving myself. By the time I was leaving, the ground had accumulated at least 2 feet of snow, and it wasn't even done snowing. The drive home was nightmarish. The roads were hardly even plowed, and I had to drive under 20 miles per hour on most roads. The roads were completely dead at this point though, most likely because everyone was smart enough to go home before the snow accumulated. Eventually I turned onto a main road that I'm sure would usually be bustling, but at 11:15 on Christmas Eve night, there wasn't a single car or a single light from a store. It was a ghost town. But then I did notice the flashing taillights of one car. It was parked on the side of the road, and the smoke seeping out from its exhaust with the taillights giving it a red tint. As I got closer, I realized there was somebody next to the car waving their hand in the air. I assumed something was wrong and they needed help. So, me being the good Samaritan I am, I pulled up behind the car. When I opened my door, the guy approached me immediately, barely even giving me time to step out. He was an average-sized man, probably 5'10", 180 pounds. He spoke in a very demanding voice, asking me if I know anything about fixing an engine. I told him I didn't know much about cars. The guy responded very quickly to everything I said. He told me it's fine. He went inside of his car for a second, popped open his trunk, came back out and told me to just wait by the trunk for a second. I had no idea what he wanted me to do. I was really confused. He walked over to the front of his car, and I heard him open the hood. I couldn't see anything he was doing since the trunk was blocking my view, and the loud wind of the snowstorm overpowered any small noises he might have been making. I put my hand on the back of the car and leaned my body in anticipation, when suddenly I heard 3 or 4 quick and aggressive footsteps in the snow behind me before I was pushed into the trunk. The man tried to close the trunk on me, but I kicked my feet up in resistance and held it up. I was able to overpower him and kick the trunk open completely.
As I took advantage of the few seconds I had to get out of the trunk, I took out my keys. He tried to grab me now, and I dug my house key right into his neck. He fell to his knees and his scream echoed down the deserted street. I was in my car and halfway down the road before he could even get up from his knees. A little further down, I called 911 and reported the guy. I came back in 10 minutes to find blue and red lights illuminating the windows of the deserted stores. The police held him until the ambulance arrived for him. I watched the whole thing, and nothing ever felt better in my life. I got home safely half an hour later and told my family everything. I was still very shaken that Christmas, and this remains possibly the most horrific thing I've ever experienced. It was Christmas Eve, 2009. I was 18 years old, working at CVS. Unfortunately, I got stuck with a closing shift on Christmas Eve, meaning I'd be the only one there until midnight. I was considering quitting over it, but my parents weren't for that. The CVS was 5 miles from my house on a rather quiet corner on a dead-end street. During the day, it would normally be busy, at least busy enough to stay in business, but past 8 o'clock it would be uncommon to see any customers. On Christmas Eve night, I didn't expect to see a single soul past 8 o'clock. My shift started at 4, and it was surprisingly busy for the first few hours. As I expected, past 8 o'clock it really started to die down. The pharmacy closed at 10 tonight for Christmas Eve. Unfortunately, that meant I'd be alone at the register up front for 2 hours. Plus, I had a crush on the girl who was working the pharmacy, and we were talking most of the time the store was empty, so I was upset she was leaving. A whole hour went by, and I only rang up one customer. Come 11 o'clock, I was already getting excited for my shift to end. I'd been the only one in the entire building besides one customer for the past hour, and I was losing my mind. Suddenly, there was a very slight tap on the window. It didn't sound intentional though, it sounded more so like somebody's zipper accidentally scraped against the glass. I turned to look out the window and saw a man out there, heavy coat on, hood over his head, baggy jeans, and black boots. He was staring right at me. A few seconds after he realized that I noticed him, he walked over to the entrance and entered the store. He stared at me as he walked past and down one of the aisles before disappearing behind the shelves. Then, 5 minutes later, the tapping noise began. It sounded like it was coming from one of the aisles. I walked a little to the right behind the counter just to check down the aisle. Nobody was there though. The tapping was so consistent and deliberate, I knew it was the man making the noise. But where was it coming from? I didn't know, but I had a sudden urge to go to the bathroom. Only problem, I wasn't supposed to go to the bathroom when there was a customer in the store and I was alone with them. 10 minutes or so passed and I didn't see the customer, but I would occasionally hear the weird tapping noise coming from one of the aisles. It got to the point that I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out from behind the counter and called out, excuse me? I started walking around the aisles, looking for this man that walked in. He was nowhere to be seen, but every aisle I entered, I would hear noises coming from the next aisle over. I walked down the candy aisle and heard some of the sleigh bells jingling on the other side of the shelf, like someone was intentionally shaking them. I tried to peek through the tiny holes in the shelves to see if I could see him. I saw something completely unexpected and horrifying instead. I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me through the tiny holes in the shelf. The eyes moved away, and then the tall man entered the aisle I was in. He was making these weird noises like a child or someone who had just escaped a mental asylum. He started laughing and doing this weird tiptoe kind of hopping over to me. It sounds funny, but it was a straight up disturbing scene, and he was approaching so fast that I actually began to fear for my life. I started walking away from him, and he followed me everywhere in his weird hopping. I was back at the front of the store, ready to call my manager or the cops. Then I looked back at him and saw that he was frozen at the end of the first aisle, maybe 20 feet away from me. His goofy, eerily happy face turned to an aggressive, angry-looking stare of malice.
I was officially done with this and walked out the front door. And to my horror, the man started charging at me. No more goofy hopping around, he was sprinting at me. I ran outside the store, too afraid to go to my car, because I feared he'd get me before I could lock the door. I ran around back and entered through the back door, which was still unlocked. I didn't know if he was still on my tail or not. I locked the door and hurried to the front of the store, where I locked the front door too. That was when I picked up the phone on the counter and called my manager, who was luckily still awake. I told him I had to leave immediately because somebody crazy was following me. Then I thought I heard something over my conversation. It was coming from inside the store. I put the phone down and realized it was the tapping again, coming from one of the aisles. I was out of that store and in my car within 20 seconds. I never came back. I called my manager when I got back home, and he called the cops. Surprisingly, nothing was stolen, or so I heard from a friend. My manager obviously wasn't too fond of me for leaving his store like that, so I never spoke to him again. I had as normal of a Christmas as possible, given what happened the day before.